Uh, okay, so welcome everyone to this workshop on critical caste studies and modern Bengal. I am Doipan Shen. It's a genuine pleasure to help bring us all together to discuss this project at some length. And so my sincere thanks to all of you who are present. This is something that is very personally dear to me. So it means a lot that you've taken the time to be here, that you are taking the time to present, that you've taken the time to help us be together in terms of the technological infrastructure, the students at presidency who came forward of their own accord. I'm deeply moved and touched. The idea for this workshop really emerged from conversations that I've been having with my co-organizer Kullan Kumar Dash for some time now.
এই কৌশিক একটু মাইকটা অফ করো কৌশিক
that I've been having with my co-organizer Kullan Kumar Dash for some time now. We felt it might be appropriate to host such a dialogue at this particular juncture in the development of scholarship about caste in this peculiar region, West Bengal. Critical caste studies, as many will know, was a project initiated by a group of scholars in Germany at Göttingen, with Gajendran Ayaturai taking the lead in some ways. I don't feel the need to rehearse their and his intervention, which is publicly available. I'd encourage you to take a look. But I do think further thought needs to be given to what makes critical caste studies critical. While recent scholarship about caste in modern Bengal has tended to focus on Dalit life and experience, our forum seeks to examine the deeper logics behind such an emphasis and to consider possibilities for more adequately attending to the history, politics, and philosophy of caste and casteism beyond such objects of analysis. So, how do we move beyond Dalit studies? How do we move beyond, importantly, Ambedkar? Baldly stated, how can the implicit equation of caste with Dalits be scrutinized? How might scholars of the region critically reframe their understanding of caste to include, centrally, the study of caste elites and how they have worked to reproduce and entrench the political and socio-economic dominance? How, for instance, was caste Hindu domination accomplished and sustained in Eastern India? How might we more effectively conceptualize casteism to make visible the ways in which supremacy has been naturalized? And this is, a very serious problem that we have in studies of West Bengal or Bengal.
I'm just interrupting, Doipayan. I think the YouTube streaming has not started. And some people are there.
না আমাদের YouTube streamingটা there is a new set of regulations that YouTube has come up with সম্রাটদা and according to that আমরা একটু delayed আমাদের ওই পারমিশন নিতে হতো একটা a day before we need to seek permission from YouTube or something like that. So our technical team they suggested that we cannot go for a live streaming through YouTube. So instead we are going for a live streaming through Facebook. YouTube এ আমরা পুরো ইভেন্টটা রেকর্ডেড একটা আপলোড করে রাখবো as soon as we are done with this
workshop. কি হচ্ছে মানে
হ্যাঁ ফেসবুকে হচ্ছে এবং ফেসবুকে স্ট্রিমিংটা anybody who even doesn't have a Facebook account can see it, can watch it.
So where is the link? Like, is there any link or
লিংক আমরা পাঠিয়ে দিয়েছি ফেসবুকের লিংকটাও আমরা সমস্ত পার্টিসিপেন্টদেরকে যে মেইলটা করা হয়েছে কালকে সেটাতে পাঠিয়ে দেওয়া হয়েছে।
আচ্ছা যদি থাকে একটু দিয়ে দিলে এখানে আমি শেয়ার করে দেব।
আমি তোমাকে আলাদা করে পাঠিয়ে দিচ্ছি। Yeah, Doipan, please go on.
No, ঠিক আছে। So anyway, conceptualize casteism to make visible the ways in which supremacy has been naturalized. Even as the workshop will encourage the exploration of such questions, it will equally advance the development of Dalit studies, in particular contributions that bring new questions and fresh evidence to wider attention, and those that seek to move beyond established arguments and positions. And I just want to say that the collection of papers that people have contributed really attend to this entire spread of concerns quite well. Rather than deepen the distinction between the study of subalterns and elites, however, this forum rests on the premise that critical caste studies must place investigations of both within a single analytical field. By widening, then, the aperture of the analysis of caste in modern Bengal, the workshop participants aspire to contribute to scholarly understanding of this social phenomenon. Now, while Kollan will introduce his own concerns in just a minute, which are entirely germane, one of the broad shifts we might consider making in our scholarship is to grasp the making of modern caste inequality and identity as grounded in the dynamics of capitalist political economy. Such an approach would have to elide both idealist, in the Hegelian sense, treatments of such social phenomenon, as well as traditional Marxist approaches to analyzing caste from the standpoint of labor or with regard to class. Instead, we could understand the formation of differences between castes as a product of the social relationships that are necessitated by capitalism, in particular, the category capital itself. Caste could thus be construed as a consequence of the abstract social domination required of members of that particular form of society. In short, I am suggesting that in the years ahead, we put caste in conversation with the historical analysis of capitalism as a historically specific form of political economy. And if I can just, speak off the cuff here, I think the reason such an intervention might be helpful is the whole issue of reproduction. How do we explain the reproduction of casteism over a prolonged period of time? We need structural explanations. Capitalism seems to me the most obvious answer in understanding why casteism has been able to reproduce itself, albeit in different ways, over prolonged periods of time, well into the present. And certainly this would apply to West Bengal as well. Kollan, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dwaypanda. It was actually Dwaypanda's constant, passionate brainstorming to come up with this kind of a workshop. I remember having these conversations almost a year ago, and we were trying to think of a template like this, critical caste studies with respect to Bengal, and initially I wasn't very sure how to go about it, but then it was Dwaypanda's insistence that ultimately made things happen. I'm also deeply indebted to a great group of students that I've got at Presidency who have really helped us in creating these platforms. So all the technological issues are being taken care of, and by these students of mine, I can't thank them enough. I will be slightly, less academic and a bit more polemical in the way I think about this workshop. And many of these polemical sort of views are born out of my almost a decade-long engagement with caste studies and Dalit studies, especially Dalit literature in the context of Bengal. There are certain things that I have been extremely worried about. And initially, when I started my journey as a researcher, I realized that there isn't much public attention that's being given to especially Dalit literary discourse. And that was somewhat painful for me as a very young researcher at that point of time. It was very disappointing. I was deeply worried as to the future of this kind of discourse. And then eventually I started noticing that a lot of people were taking interest in this, and eventually the incumbent state government formed a platform called Poshchimbango Dalit Sahitya Sanstha, with which I'm associated in some capacity, not in some official formal capacity, but I have been with the organization right from its inception. So I thought, so initial idea was to make this discourse received by the scholarly community, as well as to have larger, more popular underpinnings of this discourse. But then eventually a lot of other researchers, fellow researchers, mostly young people, they started taking interest in the domain, and ultimately it also had a political sort of dimension encapsulated in the formation of the Dalit Sahitya Sanstha in the state of West Bengal. So now it seems that this entire discourse has become, as Gayatri Spivak would have described, part of the teaching machine, as it were, part of the direct institutionalized academic community. And I think, echoing Spivak, I think this is the time we need to be more careful about. This is the time when we need to be more self-reflexive, more critical. And that's why the template of critical caste studies is so important. I agree with Dr. Shen that this is ours is an effort to move beyond the familiar tenets of Dalit studies, and I'll briefly talk about what they are. The familiar tenets of Dalit studies is the phrase that I deliberately use. But at the same time, I do not think, unlike Dipan, that we need to be, at this point, move beyond Ambedkar. I mean, I get the sense in which he speaks about it, but I think we have not yet exhausted Ambedkar's writings. In the context of critical caste studies, especially, every time I read Ambedkar, I come up with something new. So I get to see some new dimension, new kind of insight. So it is not perhaps so important to think beyond Ambedkar, but perhaps think with Ambedkar as well as with Marx and with various other kinds of thinkers. And even then, if we actually try to engage with other thinkers, other philosophers, we can be, in a more committed, more ethical sense, Ambedkarite, because Ambedkar himself is a great example of that kind of contextual thinking through which he tries to bring in a wide spectrum of thinkers, their thoughts and philosophies. And I think, Ambedkar is a great exemplar of what we now do in terms of modern intellectual history or global intellectual history of ideas. So that kind of contextual thinking is a very important fundamental template for us, I believe, to think of what we call critical caste studies, not just with respect to Bengal, but in general, in the context of larger global in South Asian study, South Asian subcontinent, as well as the South Asian diasporic existence across the globe. So critical caste studies is something that, in my opinion, can be directly, discursively derived from Ambedkar's own writings. This is not to suggest that we need to be constantly in agreement with whatever Ambedkar has said in terms of something or the other with respect to caste, but it is to suggest that the spirit can and must remain Ambedkarite in terms of that contextual thinking, in terms of his sincerest efforts to talk about, as Dipan said, the enormous capacity of the caste system to perpetuate itself. So it is at the same time something that doesn't go away, jati kabhi nahi jati. it is a resilient force, and at the same time, it is something that can change itself according to the demands of time. Dalit studies and Dalit empowerment are significant templates of what we do, or what we are trying to do here. But at the same time, it is also not exhausted by a template like Dalit studies, in the sense that it is Dalit empowerment can happen through other means. Some people are suggesting, like the Dalit India Chamber of Commerce and Industries, that capitalism can be an empowering trope for Dalits. But at the same time, I completely agree with Deepen that that template is something that we are not very sure of, because even Ambedkar himself is bracketing Marx with Buddha. So, he, as Teltumbde has suggested, Anand Teltumbde has suggested, he wouldn't have bothered to bracket Marx with Buddha if he had not had some kind of deep intellectual respect for Marx. So I'm not very comfortable with that kind of idea that capitalism can bring about some substantial kind of empowerment for the Dalits, especially in terms of an anti-caste template. I think it can bring about some immediate economic empowerment, but economic empowerment, as Ambedkar himself suggests in Annihilation of Caste, is only a very limited way of empowering Dalits, or in other words, a very limited way, a very limited way to put a stop to the caste system. So our critical caste studies is a platform through which we are not just trying to empower a particular constituency, but we are trying to think of how caste is such a resilient force, how caste, and this is a question that Ambedkar grappled with, this is a question that we need to be more increasingly grappled with in our times. How do we put an end to it? How do we annihilate it? Instead of just making sure some kind of political and economic empowerment of a certain section. I think, in my opinion, and this is a very humble opinion, people can contest this, and I'll be very happy to respond to those contestations. I think, by and large, Dalit discourse in the present day India has become extremely obsessed with political and economic empowerment. That is certainly those are important registers of empowerment. Those things certainly curb the caste system, but I'm not very sure whether they can effectively try to even make a dent in the caste system and the way it perpetuates itself endlessly, it seems. So I think that is a more important concern for us. How do we think through these problems? Why is it that the caste system is such a resilient force? What are the localized dimensions of the caste system in the context of Bengal, a region like Bengal? How does it present itself in a very nebulous, intractable manner in our social and political and cultural lives in modern Bengal and so on? So I think these are more important concerns and anxieties with which we started thinking of a template like critical caste studies and modern Bengal. So we certainly take inspiration from Ayaturai's conceptualization of critical caste studies, but at the same time, there are certain more personal, more localized, more subjective ways of looking at critical caste studies, especially in the context of modern Bengal. I think for me, that was the point of inception. That's the point of germination, as it were. And that is how it began. In a nutshell, that's the kind of perspective that I could throw on this template that we have decided to discuss today. And we are glad that we are joined by extremely insightful and sharp thinkers like Anirban Karo, Kanimran Bhattacharjee, Shomadura Roy, Ishita Roy, Samrat Sengupta. Dayavati is not going to be joining us, unfortunately, for some personal crisis. We are delighted to have this wonderful team of scholars trying to think of these questions in their own ways. So I'm really looking forward to the individual presentations. And Deepen and I have decided that the speakers will speak less in terms of the quantum of time, given to each of the speakers. They will speak roughly for 10 to 15 minutes, although it's not a very tight compartmentalization. We will be happy to listen to all these thoughts, but we will request the presenters to restrict themselves to 10 to 15 minutes of presentation, which will be followed by another 20 minutes roughly of discussion. So the scholarly exchanges are going to be more focused in our workshop rather than individual presentations, right? That's the way we thought about it. That's the way we will go about this, right? Dipanda, would you like to add something more, and then we can?
No, I mean, substantively, I'll add more, at the end of the workshop when we have a conversation. Right. About the, Aishwarya and I have been talking about this whole question of after Ambedkar or beyond Ambedkar. Right. And I'd love to share some more thoughts there. But just that, something that I found very valuable in the kinds of suggestions you made, for caste studies as a whole, is that we genuinely move beyond the emphasis on Dalits. When we think caste, why do we think Dalits? That's a very
and also in the context of Bengal, I think every time we talk about Dalits in Bengal, the caste question in Bengal, we invariably talk about the Namashudras. But in my presentation, as well as I'm sure in some of the other presentations, especially Shamudura's presentation, I think we will be talking about significant other Dalit constituencies which are not talked about usually when we talk about caste question in modern Bengal. So I think there is this enormous focus on the Namashudra community for right historical academic reasons. I'm not contesting those, but I think at the same time we need to focus on the other regions, other Dalit constituencies in the state of West Bengal. That is something that is also part of our agenda in critical caste studies and modern Bengal.
Well, and not just other Dalit communities, but OBCs, caste Hindus,
right,
quote unquote.
Right. Of course, yeah. And why not focus on caste Hindus?
Right. Acha, আমরা শুরু করি. আমরা preface করেছি. Everybody gets about half an hour. I'm going to watch the time, and I'm going to be pretty strict about the time.
I thought you wouldn't be.
Nah, man, it's just a kind of functionary role.
Right.
So it's 5:55 here on Irvan. Please take it away, and looking forward.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Very early good morning to Doipan. Thank you, everyone, for
Anirban and other speakers. We would also like to request you to introduce yourselves. I thought we would introduce you, but then we are also participants as much as you guys are.
Of course, I will. I kept that in mind. So, thank you everyone for being here on a Saturday afternoon. Thank you, of course, to all of my fellow participants for reading my work, and for thank you in advance for the comments, and of course, particular thank you to Doipan, Kollan, and to everybody at Presidency for putting this workshop together. So thank you to all of you. So I'm Anirban Karok. I just finished my PhD in South Asian history from New York University. And from September onwards, I will begin teaching as a collegiate assistant professor at the University of Chicago in the social sciences core program. So I actually thought that we should finish our presentations in 5 to 10 minutes. So I will actually not speak more than 6 or 7 minutes at most, and then I'm happy to take questions. So the paper that I sent to the other participants to read is a chapter from my dissertation, all right? So which begins broadly with the observation that from roughly the 16th century up to the present day, caste has been the object of intense critique and contestation throughout the subcontinent and also in Bengal. But despite this, caste has continued to matter in a multitude of ways, which I don't have to explain to this audience. So the motivating question of the dissertation actually is how to explain this paradox of simultaneous critique and continuity historically. So broadly speaking, my approach is to suggest that instead of getting hung up on the debates over whether caste is a religious institution or not, whether the religious dimension is important or not, I suggest that what we really need to track is the changing relationship between the religious ideology and the broader social practices that actually enable the reproduction of hierarchies or inequalities over time. Right, so here I focus mainly on two practices, the control of access to land and markets. I mean, the control of access to land is very well known, so it doesn't need to be repeated. The control of access to markets has also been emphasized by some scholars, although it has been much less studied because it's also harder to study than the control of access to land. In any case, I suggest that these two practices working in tandem together created or reproduced what I call is differential access to property and power over time. And I suggest that if we take this approach and if we try to track the changing relationship between the ideology and these two practices, then that enables three insights, roughly speaking. So the first insight is that we can see how the ideology itself responded over time to practical and social changes. And therefore, we can get away from the idea that the ideology was derived once and for all from one set of canonical religious texts. That is to say, that the ideology had a life of its own, and it was forced in some situations to respond to broader changes. The second insight, this first insight is not, of course, something you can see from the version of the paper that I sent you, but it is part of the dissertation. The second insight, which is really the main substance of the dissertation, roughly about 65-70% of it, is that I show that the critique of caste, and actually a critique of all of the three dimensions of caste, right, the two practices of differential access, as well as the religious dimension, the norms of ritual hierarchy, all three dimensions of caste were challenged and criticized during the early colonial period, roughly 1760 to 1850, by a variety of lower caste actors, which included devotional poets belonging to different sects, petty vendors and merchants, smallholders and peasants, agrarian slaves, and so on. This critique was both inspired by and contributed to the emergence of capitalism in the region. That is to say, the historiographical implication is that despite the centrality of colonial initiatives in the rise of capitalism in India, the history of capitalism in India is actually irreducible to colonial rule. In other words, there are aspects of critique, contestation, and politics within the subcontinent that can be better grasped or illuminated by a broader, I suppose, a broader social history of capitalism that doesn't necessarily underestimate the power of the colonial state. And the final third insight is that I can explain the continuity of caste, or at least the continuity of caste as a practical political economic object, as a result of the intersection between the legacy of caste itself and the contradictions or trajectory of capitalism. And what I mean by the legacy of caste is that by the late 18th and certainly by the early 19th centuries, the practices of differential access to property and power had actually generated what I call de facto separation between labor and capital. That is a separation between propertyless castes on the one hand and propertied castes on the other. Right, and I'm happy to elaborate on this further in terms of how this can be actually seen from certain trends and so on. So this, the paper that I sent you on sort of late 19th, early 20th century agrarian politics in Bengal is a version of or a part of chapter 7 of the dissertation, and it is really followed only by an epilogue which concludes the dissertation. So this really comes at the very end, sort of the last quarter or 20% of the dissertation. And the overall aim in the chapter, as well as in the dissertation, I would say, is to get away from, I would say, two kinds of extremes, right? One is the older orthodox or classically Marxist extreme that got hung up on the question of whether caste or class is the appropriate category, which I think is the wrong way to even pose the problem. But at the same time, I'm also skeptical of any approach to caste that sees it primarily as a religious or indeed primarily even a Hindu institution. And I'm also skeptical of any approach that studies caste only with reference to politics that is explicitly organized around caste as a category or around the norms of ritual hierarchy. So the overall attempt is to historicize caste or try to historicize caste without falling into the trap of simply equating it with another purportedly more modern category such as class. Right. So I think I'll stop there in terms of by way of introduction. And again, thank you for reading the paper, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So whoever wants to start out, please just jump in. Kollan and I have done most of the talking so far, and of course Anirban. But we really want to open it up to the entire floor. So please go ahead. Yeah, Rathul, please go ahead.
Yes, hello everyone. Am I audible? So,
yes.
Sir, it is a beautiful presentation. So, I was actually asking a question. It is quite related to what you pitched, but it does not actually address the period that you were directly referring to. It does not refer to the early colonial period. The differentiation between the propertied and propertyless castes that you talked, did it have an impact on the early 20th century caste-based agitations in modern Bengal? Because there, I think that the other backward castes who have a prominent landed interests, their way of discursively address the caste problems were quite different from the typical Dalit caste groups, I think. So I want to know your opinion about it.
Yes, thank you for the question. That's a very important question. Difficult to answer too substantively, but the short answer is definitely that yes, there is some relationship. So I'm not entirely sure which OBC groups you're talking about, but I would suppose the middling agricultural castes like the Shotgops perhaps, or Maishos or Agulis might be something that you're referring to. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So my point in terms of like the de facto separation between propertied and propertyless castes is that not to say that that's the only thing. First of all, that's not to say that that's the only thing that matters in the subsequent history of caste, but it is to say that along with norms of kinship marriage and the religious dimension, certainly the organization of social labor, or having some degree of say about what the structure of social labor is going to look like, is certainly always has been a constitutive aspect of caste. And so I mean to say that from the early 19th century onwards, what really matters in that sphere, right, in the sphere of the social organization of labor and who does what kind of work or not, what really matters is how you are able to participate in the increasingly commercialized networks and eventually in something like industrial or even agrarian capitalism, right? So if you look at the sources of agrarian labor, the sources of industrial labor in the middle of the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, then we will see, or if we look at the sources of labor that migrated abroad as indentured labor, and not just from Bengal, but of course, from actually mostly from places like Eastern Uttar Pradesh, Western Bihar, and so on, whether they went to the Caribbean or to the rice mills of Burma or to any other place in the Indian Ocean, to other plantations. There is, of course, not a perfect, but a very deeply substantive relationship between the previous history and the legacy of caste and who are actually the people who go and do these sorts of labors, right? So the lowest castes, exactly what you call them is up for debate, because Dalit is obviously not a category that exists in the early 19th century. But if we don't mind using a sort of anachronistic category for that period, then yes, there's various low-ranked castes, Bagdis, Bauris, etc. from Bengal. If you look at other regions, close to Bengal, like the Dosads, etc., are the ones who actually become industrial laborers and go abroad as indentured labor and so on. And the middling castes, it's not true that nobody from those castes ever goes to doesn't become industrial workers. Some do, but because in Western Bengal by the 18th and early 19th century, they are pretty well entrenched as middling castes. They are jotars in some regions. Even if they are not jotars, there are substantial riots among them. And then, as I said in the paper, I know not everybody had the opportunity perhaps to read my paper, but I said the 1859 Rent Act actually benefited that middling stratum, etc. So and so on. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of people belonging to those castes are still reasonably comfortably dependent on agrarian livelihoods by the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Don't quote me on this, but that's what I think happened. So, the short answer is that yes, of course, if that is the trajectory, then that would certainly affect the way in which these groups would approach politics. And most of them actually join nationalist mobilizations, especially in districts like Bardhaman and Mednipur. Most of these middling castes that you're referring to offer significant support to the nationalist movement.
And also, I think that is relevant because in the early colonial period, I think that these caste groups, many of these middling caste groups, middling agricultural caste groups, they actually rose to the rank of the prestigious Noboshaks. So it is that kind of period. So I think we have always, if we refer to Chandra's Chandal's words or something like that, that there is a cultural explanation that he tried to offer about the rise of this group. But I think there is a political economy aspect to that as well.
Yeah. Just to very quickly respond to that. I mean, we shouldn't overdo the rise to the Noboshaka Shudra status too much and sort of read back from the early 20th century period, because even the term Shodgop, for example, I mean, the Mahisho category becomes Mahisho in the 1901 census. Telis become Telis only in 1931, I think. The first time we have a record of the term Shodgop being used is in 1807, 8, 9, something like that. So we shouldn't overdo that too much, but I definitely agree with you that there is some economic mobility that is going on in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and that definitely affects subsequent politics. But it also affects, for example, we shouldn't forget that it also affects things like norms of marriage and attitudes towards gender, for example. So, for example, in 1857 or 8, after the Widow Remarriage Act was passed, I think some followers of Vidyasagar were trying to push through a widow remarriage somewhere in Mednipur. I'm not sure, I don't remember, and they were beaten up by upwardly mobile Shodgops, right? So there are effects of this economic and social mobility, both on cultural norms and also on politics and so on. So.
Right. Who wants to take the next question? Or pose the next question?
I want to ask something. The discussion started with the question of Namoshudros being the most prominent Dalit identity in West Bengal right now. So, and in your paper, you've discussed the conversion of the Namoshudros from other professions, particularly like being fishermen and other things, to agriculturalists. And it is frequently referred, even by in Shekhar Babu's work, that they are the largest holding of land among the. So, do you think that there is a relationship between their prominence and their being holding some amount of land? And what is the trajectory of their rise into prominence? And also their relative marginalization to other upper caste agriculturalists. Thank you.
I was muted. Yeah, that's also a difficult question to answer too substantively, because the late 19th century history is usually written in very broad strokes. So it's hard to say, exactly who is doing what at exactly what point in time. But certainly, I would suspect that certainly there is a correlation between size and just the sheer size of the group and the ability to make some political assertions later on, because it's not clear to me necessarily that in economic terms purely that the Namashudros were better off than other Dalit groups in the early to mid 19th centuries, right, between the 1820s to 50s. Whether they were in an economically better off situation than others is not entirely clear to me. I think one reason, obviously, is that their prominence, occurs at a period in Eastern Bengal when certain, like, the extent of commercialization in the region is intensifying. Right, so both the commercialization of rice and of course jute subsequently is occurring. So I think that has, and of course the land frontier isn't yet closed by the 1850s in Eastern Bengal. So the availability of land both in other parts of Eastern Bengal and also the Sundarban areas that I wrote about in the paper, I think that also has definitely something to do with it. And yeah, I think in broad strokes that is about all that can be said about the or at least I can say right now about the second half of the 19th century. And of course, in the first half of the 20th century, they get drawn into larger and larger questions of politics, nationalist politics, anti-caste politics, and what exactly its relationship is going to be with nationalism and so on, which Doipayan and others have written about in great detail. And so certainly the trajectory of the early 20th century and the difficulties of navigating that line in the political situation of that time about exactly what an anti-caste politics will be and what its relationship will be to other kinds of politics like communist movements or the nationalist movement and so on. The difficulties of navigating that and subsequently things like partition have had an enormous effect on their marginalization. So that is again, I think, actually an argument for studying distinct periods in terms of their historical contexts, rather than thinking about sort of one straightforward line that can be drawn from previous periods to the present.
If may I jump in at this point? Anwar, what a wonderful project and paper. I'm so glad this is what you've done. I'm so glad you're going to Chicago. It's just wonderful all around. I'm sure you know that one of the criticisms of Andrew's deployment of Lockeanism, which you've obviously kind of refurbished for the particular caste groups you're working with, is that how do you correlate it to some form of indigenous thought? And in this sense, it's obviously not a question I'm particularly sympathetic to, but it's a question that nonetheless comes up. That clearly, Bengali Muslims in the 1930s were not aware of Locke. And so what is it, what kind of body of intellectual grounding is actually correlating to Lockeanism? So in this sense, my question for you is, you studied quite a spectrum, but if you were to produce a kind of lowest common denominator, what is it that Lockeanism is analogous to in quote-unquote Dalit or middling caste thought in the early 19th century? And this is the reason I bring this up, is because it's the early 19th. I have very little grounding in this period and I'm fascinated by it. So I'm genuinely curious to know what your thought is about this.
Yeah, that's obviously a very big question, and there are several aspects to it that need actually careful reflection and a response. I would just say that first of all, to ask for what is analogous in indigenous thought is actually not a very good way of posing the problem, because the fact that the Pagalpanthis are not aware of Locke is actually makes the question much more interesting, and it makes the question much more harder to answer, and it actually shows the need to historicize. So my argument would be that the reason they are making this argument, and the core of the argument really, if we cut out all of the things, obviously they are not using terms like the state of nature or natural law. They have no idea about these terms, and they're not saying that. And they are expressing it in a deeply religious idiom, right? They're influenced by different strands of Sufism, and their entire argument is about, that having sort of God's say on the earth, right? So it's also another kind of argument about divine order, but not just based on caste, or it's based on the idea that all individuals are equal in the eyes of God, and therefore everybody has the right to constitute some property in land, and everybody is going to labor and constitute only that much property that they can use before impinging on other people's ability to produce property. And that is feasible in the early 19th century in the Sherpur Pargana of Mymensingh, because there is actually surplus land. If there is not enough land, then this Lockeanism is going to just fall flat on its face, which is what I say is happening by the early 20th century, right? So I'm not very invested in these earlier debates, right? When Gautam Bhadra was writing his book on Iman and Nishan in the early 90s, he's very concerned to argue against, more quote-unquote modernist secular historians who are going to say, oh, underneath the religious idiom, it's really only just about, getting land, etc. secular. I'm not very invested in it at all. I don't really care that it's expressed in a religious idiom. In fact, it's good. It makes it more interesting. But what I would say is that even if it is expressed in a religious idiom, and it certainly is, we would still want to be able to distinguish the content of different kinds of religious discourses, right? I mean, we wouldn't want a Ram Rajya, right? I mean, Ram Rajya is also a religious discourse. So just saying it's a religious idiom isn't enough. So we have to get into the content. And I think while the content is not presented in exactly the same terms as Locke uses in the late 17th century, the structure of the argument ultimately is the same. It's labor that is constituting property, and it's a kind of property right that is distinct from the right of the state to ask for revenue. Because if you think about pre-colonial law, right, by pre-colonial law, what the kind of law that the Mughals followed, or Murshid Quli Khan, the way he increased assessments in the early 18th century, the colonial state has every right to ask for increased assessment, because the state increases its assessment periodically, right? Todar Mal did it, then Murshid Quli did it, then the colonial state did it. So it's a new argument. It's an argument against the right of the state, and it's to say that there is, you have the right to take revenue, but I have a different kind of right, because I inputted this labor, and so I have a right in the increased fertility of the soil, the benefits that arise from the increased fertility of the soil. And the final point I would say that if there is any fear of deracination or of the imposition of non-indigenous categories on indigenous thought, if that fear is indeed a mortal fear, then let's get rid of terms like Lockean or liberal. Just get rid of that. Doesn't really matter for the it's important, because it doesn't really matter for the argument that I'm really interested in, which is that Langol jar jomitar everybody is saying in 20th and even 21st century Bengal, right? So, and that is deeply premised on this idea that labor constitutes property. It's a defense of smallholding property against capital, preventing small labor from constituting its own property. So the point simply is that in what way is this argument adequate for an agrarian politics? In what way is this argument an adequate critique of caste? And in what way is this an adequate critique of caste in the long run in a capitalist context, right? Those are, in terms of a critical caste studies, those are ultimately the most important questions that follow from the implication. So if we are worried about the terminology of Lockeanism or liberalism for the purposes of thinking about the subsequent history, we can get rid of it. It doesn't really matter for the political questions at hand, especially for the 20th century and later.
Anyway, I have so many other questions, but I'll pass it on to others. Whoever else wants to pose a question to Anirban, please raise your hand or just jump in.
Joydeep has joined us, I think. Joydeep Datta. Joydeep's own dissertation also engages with the question of land in a different way altogether. His go-to point is, of course, Heidegger's idea of grounding and so on. So I was wondering if Joydeep has something to say on Anirban's paper, and Joydeep has also diligently read all the papers. I know that from our conversations. So would Joydeep like to comment on it, or we can just move on to the next presentation? I had a similar question on Lockeanism, etc., but Dalit has already asked that kind of question, so I won't repeat, but we can have these conversations later on as we go ahead. So if Joydeep doesn't have any question, then we can, or any other participant.
Well, what time are we? Yeah, I guess we could move on. Anirban, is that okay with you?
Yeah, it's fine. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
No, I mean, I have more questions, but I'll write to you at some point.
Sure. And I mean, if you have more time at the end, that's also fine.
Yeah, I mean, no, we do have just about 5 more minutes. So if I can just, push you on this one issue.
Can I jump? Can I move into it? Do you have some time? 2-3 minutes? Can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
Yes.
Anirban, go ahead, please.
So,
Anirban to Anirban.
Yes. So since you were spotlighting on the Paglaidhum event and where there is the continuous transaction between the two poles, one is the religious and the political, and when you were actually critiquing and combining the question of class and caste together, then I was thinking that when I was thinking about the politics of resistance at this moment, that when the question of usurpation of property rights and all these questions are getting in, and again these are being done in terms of when there is no injury to the property rights. This has been there in your argument, and so and everything happening when these people, especially the cultivators, and when you were talking about the different castes, Aguri, Koivarta, Shodgop, etc., and they are always already subsumed under the production, circulation, and distribution of the capital. Then I was thinking that my question would be that how do you pose these cultivators when they are resisting and not only deeply imbued with the religious ideologies, and also there is a continuous transaction with the political and subsumed within the circulation and distribution of the capital, then how do you conceive this kind of resistance in terms of this class and caste kind of transaction, binary or connection?
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but I would say that I'm not making the argument that they are subsumed under capital. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't use that term, right? So what I'm trying to suggest.
I am actually thinking when I am talking about these cultivators and others, they are when this production, distribution, and circulation of the capital are happening all across the state, and all these things are happening. There is also the rotting class already there, and in Paglaidhum episode and Imanunishan, there is a discussion around this. Yes.
Yeah, well, the rentier class is of course there. The zamindars are of course there, and they are primarily upper caste in the situation in which the rebellion is happening. as I mentioned in the article, I mean the paper, most of the zamindars are kaisthos. So certainly there is a caste dimension to the question of who is the rent receiver and who is has a right that is carved out of the historical right of the state to get revenue. So actually, in a sense, the rentier classes are not very capitalist at all. I mean, the colonial state had hoped that they would be, although this region was not part of the permanent settlement, but the permanent settlement, there was the hope that the rentier class would be, but they're not. They didn't turn out to be. So I'm not saying that everything is explained by the trajectory of capitalism. Quite the contrary. What I'm saying is the nature of capitalism in the region, the way capitalism is actually able to function, and the kinds of contradictions it subsequently generates actually depends on the previous history of caste, which is exactly what I said at the beginning, right? That the history of caste constituted this differential access to property and power, and by the late 18th centuries, those practices, not modern capitalism, right? Those earlier practices had already created some separation between property and propertyless caste. So that is not something that capitalism did or even the colonial state did. That is already done by previous histories of caste. That's entirely on us. That's entirely on us. That's an entirely indigenous history, so to speak. So the argument simply is that the way in which different groups are therefore able to participate. I mean, why did Ram Mohan Roy, when he was talking about participation, collaboration between Indians and Europeans in terms of capitalism, etc., why did he never say anything about the abolition of slavery, etc.? Like, how are people who don't have, who have never had any serious access to property or heritable rights to property, how would they participate in a commercial society? I mean, they would have to provide the labor, right? So that's what I'm saying about what is going on at that time. And I'm simply saying that, they're making an argument that seems to me to have something to do with the ways in which commercial crop production, whether that's rice in the West or indigo in central and western Bengal, are becoming dependent on larger and larger networks of capital, right? Dependent on larger networks of capital doesn't mean that people have no autonomy to say things of their own. Of course, they are expressing whatever they're saying in an idiom that is deeply their own, right? I have 3 chapters on Vaishnava and Shakto poetry, which are, of course, the key idioms in which people think. That is the culture of the people. So that is deeply important. But that doesn't mean that whatever is being said, the content of that religious expression can be entirely understood in terms of traditions that have just been handed to us for a very long time. I guess, long story short, what I'm trying to say is that very often when we use the word religion, we use it as if it's never changing, but actually it always changes. And so what I'm trying to say is that the content and, even if the idiom is very long-standing, the content of it can have and did have, I think, subtle changes, and those changes need to be understood in historical terms that may or may not convince everybody, but, I think everybody still has to explain the newness of the claims, because, as far as we know, such claims were not made in the 18th century. 100 years ago, when Murshid Quli Khan increased the assessments quite drastically, actually, he increased the assessments in a way that had never been done in the 17th century. So after Todar Mal's assessment in 1582, Murshid Quli was the first to increase the assessment. We don't know of any rebellion at that time that made any such claims. So why did it happen in the 1820s and 30s? So even if one is not convinced by my explanation, everybody still has to explain why the 1830s and why not the 1720s.
Thank you so much, Anirban. Let us take a 5-minute break, and then I believe the next person is Tramrat. Tramrat, are you there? আচ্ছা, তো 5 মিনিটে শুরু করি।
No problem.
আচ্ছা।
Every time Shamratda switches on, I think there is something that is wrong, that some kind of noise is coming in. So it might be a problem when Shamratda starts presenting.
Is there any noise now? I've just switched on my microphone.
Can you do something? Can you speak for a minute or so, and then we can be sure whether it's a problem?
Yeah, just I'm trying to speak, but it's perfectly clear for me.
Yeah. Now, I think that when the other person speaks,
yeah, then
there is a problem.
Yeah, maybe, perhaps.
Yeah,
but
it's fine with you. It's fine with your mic. It's okay.
কিছু শোনা যাচ্ছে না কেন? মানে কিছু কি বন্ধ হয়ে গেছে নাকি আমার এখানে কিছু প্রবলেম হচ্ছে? আমি কিছুই শোনা যাচ্ছে।
5 মিনিট ব্রেক চলছে।
আমরা এই মুহূর্তে আবার শুরু করছি, মিস্টার মন্ডল। আচ্ছা, তো সম্রাট।
Yeah, here I am.
আচ্ছা, শুরু করে দাও তাহলে।
Yeah, I think some of you know me already, so but I'm just introducing myself. Like I am teaching English at the department at the University of Shidukanu-Bisha, and my presentation will be on. Like I hope you've already read some of you. It will be on displacement as a paradigm of existence, and basically I will speak on the experiential narratives of the Dalits, and I'll basically trying to think of what Aniket Javare calls a kind of Dalit sociability, challenging the notion of a sociality which assumes society as a concrete pre-existing whole. So basically, presentation will also be about forgetting the existing historical anthropological scholarship in a deterministic way, in a situational way. Some of my colleagues are doing that, they're wonderful work, but I'm trying to think of the trans-historical, atemporal nature of caste, which is functioning for a long period of time and getting self-replicated in other contexts, in other ways. So basically, I'm trying to think of the epistemology of caste and how it continues in different form, particularly in the context of Bengal. As Colin has already mentioned, I think my narrative also focuses largely on Namashudras, but I think this epistemological paradigm might be of use to not only other Dalit communities, but also to read Dalit experiences of other states. So basically linking the question of caste and partition. We have seen that in the context of, because I'm studying the late 20th century experiential narratives of Dalits, now Dalit Navashudros. So in that context, we can think of the invisibility of the question of caste in partition studies for a long period of time, unless the silence has been broken by people like Shekhar Bandyopadhyay or Doipayan Babu. It has been focused by Urvashi but not elaborated. The silences in the case of gender has been elaborated. The experiential narratives of women during the partition has been elaborated, but not so much of work has been done until recently on the relationship between caste and partition. And I'm particularly looking at the epistemological dimension of it and trying to link the experience of the caste as a form of negative epistemology. I'm calling it a negative epistemology in terms of ungroundedness. And I'm taking up the concept of ground or grounding from Heidegger's essay, The Principles of Grounding, where he defines ground. I'll just read ground of understanding things assumes generality which crosses the individual and the particular and assumes normalcy. The ground is not law, but according to Heidegger, a kind of fundamental structure of causality on which everything could be measured. Opposed to ground stands nothing. In Heideggerian principle, nothing is not simple opposition to ground, and the principle of ground will no longer read nothing is without ground, but rather nothing is without ground. So Heidegger is basically transforming the that no thing can exist without ground into a principle of nothingness. And I'm trying to read the Dalit experience in terms of nothingness because they are actually negated from what Heidegger calls aroundness of the experience of the being. In Heideggerian thinking, just to summarize in one or two sentences, who are not aware or engaged with his thought, the being, the subjectivity, the being of the subject is defined in terms of its experience of the world. And through the experience of the world, a certain kind of de-worlding, a movement towards the world of the subject happens. And the subject knows himself through that experience. The very idea of knowing is constituted by the experiences of the world. And I'm basically talking about the negation of the Dalits in terms of religion and also in terms of history continuously in a paradigmatic way to keep them outside the sphere of experience, the sphere of positive experience, the sphere of experience which grounds one to his culture and society. And it is also a form of spatial alienation. The word ground is something which is denominationally a kind of spatial term. And this spatial term suggests is both symbolic and in practice. That is, the Dalits are excluded in actuality. That is, if you follow Ambedkar's discussion on the untouchables, they are the antojos. Antojos means ante jato, who are born in the end of the village, who are kept outside the village. And this very idea of being outside the village is replicated until number of times from ancient till modern days, where the Dalits are always kept outside the mainstream society, mainstream structure of the society. So this experience of spatial alienation, which is literal but also symbolic, because Dalits are kept outside, not only in terms of space, but in other ways also, where the space translates in a symbolic way, and they are not put into what Heidegger calls aroundness of the being. The being is produced by its aroundness. That from that aroundness they are negated, they are excluded. And this experience gets replicated in modernity in a significant way, which is the focus of my study, where the religious injunctions are not always functioning in a strict way, that people are not burdened by a kind of religious quote-unquote prejudice to exclude caste, particularly in the context of Bengal. It is overtly and openly said that there is no caste problem in Bengal. But caste comes back in a different way in the form of a kind of value, the production of value, but the grounded experience of the being negates, the epistemological experience of the being negates the inclusion of the Dalit in terms of culture and physical existence. So if I think in these terms, I'll start with a quote from which I mentioned in my paper by Jotin Bala. I'm studying particularly in this paper I focused on Jotin Bala, but similar instances are seen in case of other Dalit writers also who write on their negative experiences or who root their identity to their surroundings in terms of negation, in terms of exclusion, and it brings out a new form of understanding the world as it is, instead of being grounded instead of as a being as the being in the world, being who is immersed in the world as a part of the world, to being as not being in the world. So the quote, this is from a poem by Jotin Bala, which I tried to translate myself. Our life inhered from forefathers, like a trivial piece of soiled paper thrown in some old stained abandoned basket full of waste. In hunger, poverty, disease and pain, day and night, our tattered life struggles to survive. And in this particular poem, there are many codes to suggest how negative experiences constitutes the being of the Dalit. Because the question of the forefathers is brought here, that how it is a historical, trans-historical, ancient form of exploitation which continues even today in forms of religious scriptures, but also in the present moment where the Dalits' lives are considered as wasted. And there are different forms of alienation of the Dalit subject, and the different forms of alienation, if I talk about them, the first form of alienation is the religious alienation. Then there is the spatial alienation by keeping the Dalits always outside the mainstream society, which we see repeatedly in the Dalit experiences. Even before the partition, their abode, their place of belonging was always kept outside the privileged spaces, which are more closely connected with the lines of communication. And there is also that is one thing, and then we have the alienation in forms of keeping out their experiences from trajectories of discussion. For a long period of time, we have seen that the Dalit experiences are kept outside the scope of discussion. Even in the literary circle, in Bengali literature, there is a proliferation of autobiographies and also fiction based on autobiographies. And many people have written about partition. There are thick volumes of partition narratives, stories on partition, like Bhed Bibhed or Raktomonir Hare, brought out by Sahitya Academy. And these books hardly record the Dalit writings in them until very recently, when we see the proliferation of Dalit writings. So these experiences are negated in that way as well. And then the forgetting, the kind of negation of the existence of the Dalits physically, when the question of partition comes. The way the partition happened, it has been discussed heavily by Daipan Babu and Shekhar Babu, in that how partition actually initiated the negation of Dalit politics, Dalit political consolidation, by creating it in a way that the Dalits were the worst victim of the partition in terms of space. And after that, another form of alienation is when they traveled to this part of the Bengal from the East Pakistan. They experienced a kind of complete negligence by the government, and they were treated almost in an inhuman way, though they were, it's ironic that they were accepted as citizens. So they were what Udit Sen calls a kind of citizen subject, in a very precarious sense, that they were citizens, but at the same time they were refugees. Citizen refugees is a very ironic term. And in the host society they were excluded and not welcome, and their experiences. I'll just narrate one portion where the yeah Jotinbala, he belongs to the Namashudra caste. He was born in 1949 and he migrated to India in 1954 and after experiencing the communal riots, and he actually narrates the inhuman condition in which he had to migrate to this side of the border, and in a complete, almost living like a homo sacer, bare life openly on the along the traveling across the Joshua Road in a completely precarious sense. And he was kept in different refugee camps. I am sure that Joydeep will talk in details about the refugee camps and the precarious forms of existence in the refugee camps, where death, disease, lack of proper food, and healthcare, and living closely with the experience of dirt and filth is a part of that experience, is a part of their everyday. And that constitutes their narrative, their state of belonging. Like the way, my basic point is, with this I will end my presentation. The basic point is that the complete naturalization and normalization of the experience of life as positive, as universal, is contested in the Dalit narrative, who frequently focuses on death, the experience of death, the experiences of spatial alienation, the experience of disease, the experience of suffering. The question of suffering in our narratives on life is often alienated in the way the Dalits are also alienated. The Dalits are associated with this negative experience and they bring back this negative experiences as a part of the universe, and they cause a certain kind of unworlding of the world instead of deworlding. They are continuously unworlding our world, and that is very, very important in the context of Indian epistemology, which is often dominated by the notion of a karma, where you should do what you should do. So there is a kind of epistemological inversion where you denaturalize the process of living and open up the spaces to ask questions about alienation as a form of belonging, as a different form of belonging, where you denaturalize belonging, because the Dalit life is often naturalized as something to be negated. With this, I stop. I hope you have read the paper and you can take up the discussions from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamrat. Please go ahead, whoever would like to pose the first question. Joydeep, please go ahead.
Thank you, Samrat. Thank you, the presentation. Samrat, just you know my work also, and I know this paper. The first, my curiosity that you are talking about nothingness, and also I know this. You know this Heidegger talks about the nothingness is actually critique of metaphysics, right? And also simultaneously alienation. Uh, do you think this kind of alienation is distancing the other, right? Is it a distancing? And also, my one curiosity that is, how do you look at this? If it is your proposition that you presented or you send it, so what do you look at the history of the Dalit question? Are you criticize the history actually? That's my curiosity to know. This is not a particular question actually. That is.
Yeah. The question of alienation, definitely the experience is grounded, or if I refer to Heidegger, ungrounded for the Dalits. Their experience is such that the experience is narrated in the form of ungroundedness, that is alienation. But my point is that alienation does not negate it completely. It negates the Dalit experience, but it cannot completely erase the experiential narratives. They come and they intervene into the mainstream thinking of belonging, substantiality, experience as such. And this experience is narrated or expressed in the form of indefiniteness. Indefiniteness is a paradigm of thinking instead of groundedness. And groundedness is something which substantiate existence, like the planning, the way we think about political economy, the way we think of anthropological understanding of the being, of the self. All these knowledge systems, I would say, these knowledge systems tries to, even while criticizing the caste politics, the casteism in India, they try to think the Dalit question, the caste question in concrete epistemological terms. The epistemological understanding is taken for granted. It forms a kind of value on which the other things are grounded. So I'm trying to think of a kind of epistemology which is informed by this alienation. First of all, it is epistemological alienation, but that epistemological alienation does not alienate it completely from the epistemology. I'm thinking of bringing it back to the epistemological question and unground our forms of thinking in a philosophical way from that experience, instead of translating the experience in a historical way. And coming back to your historical question, that is, I think, a very, very important question, that whether I'm criticizing the Dalit history. First of all, Anirban Karak was in the beginning talking about that anachronism in the use of the word Dalit, but I would not entirely agree with him. I would think that Dalit is a term which is a politically loaded term, and it's good to be anachronistic because it's a form of re-questioning, restructuring our reading of history. So I'd not say that I'm criticizing entirely the the forms of Dalit history or the way Dalit history is made, but I'm trying to reconfigure the question of Dalit experience. Yeah. Two more hands are raised, I think.
There's Kollan, there's Shubhendu, and then Devupoma. So
Samartha, could you please switch off your mic and then I'll ask my question.
I think it's Kollan first. Yeah, please.
Okay, Samartha, there are two questions. One is a philosophical question. We have had innumerable conversations on how Ambedkarite turned to Buddhism, and my readings of Madhyamika Buddhism, which talks about nothingness, which talks about sunyata, and on the basis of those conversations and on the basis of your present paper that we are discussing, I was wondering how, or I'm not even sure whether you have looked into this, but do you think there is a possibility for us to look into possible philosophical connections between Heidegger's notion of crossed out being and the Ambedkarite / Buddhist / Dalit kind of turn to sunyata? Is there a connection between these two? Do you find a discursive possibility to connect these two things? Your readings of Jatin Bala's autobiographical novel, I would say. That's the way I describe it. Shikar Chhana Jibon, for instance. Do you relate your readings? Do you think this is relatable? Your readings of Jatin Bala's Shikar Chhana Jibon relatable to that kind of philosophical comparative framework between Ambedkarite turn to Buddhism, my readings, and you are aware of my readings, and Heideggerian notion of crossed out being. So, in other words, is there a connection between the Heideggerian notion of crossed out being and the way you are thinking of grounding and ungrounding? And these are questions I'm sure that will come up once again in the next session after the evening break when we listen to Anirban Bhattacharya's paper, because that is also a paper that talks about similar issues, as well as Joydeep's paper, which is about Heideggerian notion of grounding and ungrounding in a different way with respect to the camp life in West Bengal. So that's one. The second question is, how do you look at the idea of rootedness? Shikor Chheda Jibon, there is this rootlessness of life, Dalit life that Jatin Bala is talking about throughout the narrative of Shikor Chheda Jibon. And I'm so fascinated with Jatin Babu's writings. And the way you are talking about Heidegger's idea of grounding / ungrounding. Questions, both are connected to Heidegger, but from two different domains. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a long question, but I'm trying to respond because the first part is more interesting to me, appealing, because that is something which I'm working on right now, and I'm trying to connect because it's going to be the part of a book I intend to write, and I think I'm trying to connect this section on Heidegger with the Madhyamika Buddhism of Nagarjuna and the Sahajiya Buddhism, which Shashi-Bhushan Dasgupta discusses in details in Obscure Religious Cults, the book. First of all, I would like to respond that we can have many conversations on this, Kullan, because we might disagree also. But I think that so far as I have read Ambedkar's work on Buddhism, I think Ambedkar follows a trajectory where the emphasis is much more on healing, because Ambedkar's work had a political age of positing, and many people have talked about that. Even in the introduction of the book, which is brought out by OUP, it is discussed that many people thought that there is a political age to Ambedkar's formulation of Buddhism, and I think that in positive light, where the emphasis is on healing. But if you think of more mystical versions of Buddhism, which is in circulation in the context of Bengal, which also has, I would say, the anti-caste potential, and which is carried forward by this Buddhist lokayatic cult, has been carried forward till recent times in the folk songs of the Bauls and Fakirs also, that kind of sensibility, which is more mystical, which is more indirect, which is more indefinite, I'd say, borrowing again from Heidegger. It's more indefinite. And the focus is on Shunyata. And Shunyata is not nothingness in a exact literal way. It's a kind of epistemological void which enables you to think. It's an epistemological void where it enables you to think and to unground your existing experience. And it challenges the karmic, Brahminical notion of karma in a particular way. So the more it is more philosophical. I'd not say that Ambedkar doesn't talk about the philosophical side of it, but he is more inclined towards that political age. So my work goes towards there, and I think there can be possible connections, because I was reading the influence of Zen Buddhism on Heidegger as well. There have been many works on there is this book called Hidden Sources of Heidegger, and the Indian sources of Heidegger were there, and Zen Buddhism had a Indian and Chinese sources, and Zen Buddhism has a very major influence on Heidegger. I think definitely this work can be, to answer your question in one sentence, that definitely Heideggerian idea of crossed out being can be connected with the notion of Shunyata. But I would like to connect it in a more Sahajiya Lokayato way, and also in a more materialistic way.
Right. Unlike the way I, for instance, connect these two through Madhyamaka Buddhism of Nagarjuna. get it. Yeah.
So, and there are many narratives, mystical narratives, mystical storytelling, poetry in the pre-modern Bengal, quote unquote pre-modern Bengal, which talks about this shunyata and prakriti and purush as the two principles of shunyata and compassion. Almost on one side there is shunyata, there is on the other side there is a compassion, and the union between the two. I also intend to talk about, because towards the end of the paper which I wrote, there is this mention of the man and the woman copulating in a kind of funeral space, in a funeral ground. The man and woman, the Dalit man and Dalit woman who could not find space anywhere in the city, they come there and they get a space to take shelter, and they are coming together and uniting. It is almost like the Purush and Prakriti in Tantric Buddhism. It seemed to me like that. And in the space of Shunyata, there is this possibility of compassion, the connection between Shunyata and compassion. Because nothingness in existential philosophy is often read as a kind of, it leads to a kind of absurdist philosophy. But this is not absurdist in that sense. So we can have more conversations on this. I'm sorry, I've lost the second question. I think we can discuss that later, if you don't mind.
Right. Could you also again switch off your mic so that I can speak? I'm particularly intrigued by this dimension of your work, because I have read your work twice. In the earlier version of your paper that you contributed to my edited volume, which is about to come out very soon, on Bangla Dalit literature, and the recent one in which you are carrying forward some of those thoughts. I'm particularly interested in these dimensions of your work because for a substantial amount of time, I have been interested to see whether Ambedkar's turn to Buddhism is essentially a political move, or it is something that leads us into a more ontological domain. At one point of time, I just had an intuition, as it happens with a lot of researchers in these fields. I was just, in terms of my own lived experiences as a Bahujan lower caste man, I was somewhat uncomfortable with the way Partha was reading these kind of Ambedkarite turn to Buddhism as simply, and not just Partha, but also a lot of other people. As you rightly mentioned, that you came across some references in the Oxford University Press book on Ambedkar's Buddhism. There are wonderful writings by Gokhale and others in that book. I think a lot of people, right from the time when Ambedkar and his followers turned to Buddhism in 1956, till very recently, at the time of the publication of The Politics of the Governed by Partha, I think people have had this idea that Ambedkar's turn to Buddhism, Ambedkar's Navana Buddhism, is essentially a political move. There is a very parochial notion of politics that is at work when people say this, including the observations made by Chatterjee in Politics of the Governed, the first chapter. I was uncomfortable with it to begin with. But then I started reading Ambedkar's Buddha and his Dhamma, and I realized that Ambedkar's turn to Buddhism is not simply a political act in a somewhat reductive political parochial sense, and it does have more intense philosophical ontological issues. Not to prioritize one over the other. I'm not suggesting by any chance that the ontological and the philosophical is somehow more important than the political. I'm not doing that kind of hierarchization, but just to put it like this, I think Ambedkar's turn to Buddhism does have ontological, existential, and philosophical dimensions that are to be patiently reckoned with, something that Chatterjee doesn't do. And then I eventually got, very recently, I was approached by Biblio to write a review article of the recently published book Apart by Ashok Gopal. And Ashok Gopal now, fortunately, has... So my response to Chatterjee was to go for a deep textual, philosophical reading of how Ambedkar turns to Buddhism and what is there in Buddha or Karl Marx and what is there in Buddha and his Dhamma. But then I got some sort of validation, empirical validation in Ashok Gopal's book. It is an intellectual biography of Ambedkar, in which Gopal is suggesting by looking into Ambedkar's Marathi writings that Ambedkar was turning to Buddhism in 1930s, 40s. I mean, it's not like, there is a sudden political move after getting frustrated with the templates of Enlightenment modernity, as Chatterjee puts it. That Ambedkar is frustrated with the state and the efficacies of the state to bring about certain empowering, methods, as it were, to empower Dalits and other depressed classes people. Ambedkar is thinking of turning to Buddhism way before that. So chronologically it can't be substantiated. So I agree with you in one sense when you say that your observation on Ambedkar at turn to Buddhism can be still considered as political, but at the same time I disagree with the other way of looking at the same statement, not the way you are looking at, but certainly in the way Partho and others are looking at it, that this is political, and then Ambedkar gets frustrated at the fag end of his life. He resigns from the cabinet and then turns to Buddhism. It is as if a man of politics, in active politics, after getting disgruntled with it at the end of his life, when he's very old and frustrated with this kind of political life, he turns to Buddhism. It is like old people turning to some kind of spiritual quest at the end of his life. I think that's the way of looking.
Sorry, to সময়ের ব্যাপারটা আছে।
No, that's it. I was about to end. Anyway, so let's now move on to the next question. Anirban had a question.
Anirban had a question. So Anirban, if you could pose it quickly, we've
yes.
Gone over time. So
yes. Thank you. So I was thinking of Shamrada using of Heidegger's notion of aroundness and also of grounding. The Heidegger uses the term and that he will argue to that it's absent for Dalit subject. That I have closely done through your paper, and I was thinking that if it can be seen that not only it is implying a kind of direction in the term aroundness, but at the same time when you were looking around, turning around, a sense of overturning, sense of resistance is already there in the using of the term or aroundness. If it can be seen as an act of resistance, as a sense of resistance implied. That is my first question, and the second one is that is again connected with it, that the idea of the ground, when Heidegger is using he is actually using the term ratio. It's a Latin ratio, not the German Vernunft, and that is reason. And while he is using the term ratio, he is actually differentiating it, a slight kind of differentiation from the idea of reasonableness with the rootedness that you have argued when you are talking about the uprooting of the self of the Dalit subject and all these things, the sense of uprootedness. So that I was thinking of that subtle difference, because the grounding itself also including the idea of ungrounding already there. That ungroundedness is there because it is different from the rational and reasonableness. So I was thinking, how do you think of this kind of overturning, this kind of resistance implied within ground or within the concept of aroundness? How do you think of this thing? That's basically my question.
I would say that that this dimension of, I did not have time to discuss that in details, but that I had a section on Heidegger's, like Freud's. Most people talk about Freud's discussions on uncanny, but uncanny as unhomely, which is both connotes the familiar and the unfamiliar. it also gets mentioned in Heidegger. Heidegger is talking about he's talking about the notion of the connection between the home and ruins. Carl discussed this in detail in his work. There is a connection, there is a very close connection with the ruins and the notion of home. And when Heidegger invokes, I think when Heidegger invokes the notion of grounding, he's actually also critiquing the notion of a scientific grounding. He's basically critiquing the notion of scientific reason, so far as I understood the essay. And his question, actually, he's critically thinking about the ground. Ground is not grounded always and already, but ground is something which is constituted through the experience of the being. But if you go back to again Derrida's reading of Heidegger in general, well, at the end, Heidegger posits kind of metaphysics of presence. So that groundedness, which is produced through the aroundness,
Yes.
aroundness which is indefinite, gets connected through this process of regroundedness of the being to the world, which I'm trying to question, because if someone is negated out from that aroundness from the beginning epistemologically, like the Dalit subject, as in the language of Ambedkar, if someone is kept outside the fold, there is an essay of Ambedkar with this name, outside the fold, and I read it not only literally outside the village but also symbolically outside the epistemology. Then what happens? That is my concept of research, which I'm still developing.
Yes. Yeah, actually, the womb is a very strong word. It also implies the idea of haunting, being hauntedness. It's not only that lying around, but also the self is continuously being haunted by something. That's it there. In articulation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Okay,
Shamrat. I'm so sorry, man. There are other questions, but we need to move on. Unless Kollan, what do you think we should do?
Yeah, we should now. I think Shubhendu has a question, but we can take Shubhendu's question in the end. We can move on to the next presentation.
Yeah.
We can
Yeah.
if someone else has to ask a question, can put it in the chat box. I think that is better.
Yeah, I think Shubhendu, would you please put your question in the chat box? We can take it up later on.
Okay, so next, Shumadhura.
Is Shumadhura there?
Yes, I'm here. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this workshop. I work as assistant professor at Delhi University, and alongside I'm also doing my PhD. My work is on Rajbangshi folk songs, and I have been looking at it through the lens of gender, class, and marginality, but I have not particularly focused on the study of these folk songs through the lens of Dalit theory per se. But thanks to this workshop, it helped me reorient my understanding and enabled me to think and ask certain important questions, like maybe how can we integrate the Rajbangshi discourse, which is not just limited to the question of caste, rather questions of race, class, ethnicity, language, culture becomes important here. So how can we integrate this kind of a Rajbangshi discourse within the Dalit discourse per se? And I was thinking if there is a way that through the reading of Rajbangshi folk songs, we can maybe make the Dalit discourse more inclusive in a certain way. And here, Satyanarayan Adappa's understanding of the Dalit as the emancipatory ideology of the oppressed subject has been helpful. So what I'm going to present today is my initial thought about how maybe the lens of Dalit theory may be applicable to the study of the Rajbangshi folk songs also. So, like I said, the Rajbangshis, they have changed their identity. They have rephrased the way They talk about their community over the time, and at different historical junctures, different parameters of identity came to the foreground. So Girindra Narayan Ray actually talks about the Rajbangshi identity as a fuzzy identity. So if you look at the colonial discourse, in the colonial discourse, race becomes an important defining parameter of the Rajbangshi identity. You have Dalton, who talks about Rajbangshis as non-Aryans or Dravidians. Then Hunter talks about them as semi-Hinduized aboriginals. Risley talks about them as a Dravidian tribe with an admixture of Mongoloid blood. So, and in order to counter these discourses of racial inferiority, the Rajbangshis reinvent the myth of Parsurama and they assert their Aryan ancestry. And then, of course, within the national discourse or, within the larger discourse in Bengal, the Rajbangshis are seen as a lower caste community. Swaraj Basu talks about how the Rajbangshis were treated as the Antoja caste alongside the Namashudros and Kods. And of course, there are lots of autobiographical accounts within the Rajbangshi community which talk about practices of untouchability and, the different kinds of caste discrimination faced by the members of the community. And in relation to this, you have the rise of the Kshatriya movement around the 1910, which was spearheaded by Panchanan Verma. Then you also have the tribal discourse, which comes to prominence, and there is a fragmentation of the Rajbangshi identity between the Koch identity, which is a tribal identity, and the Rajbangshi identity, which is considered to be the Hindu Kshatriya identity. But again, here, many critics have pointed out that the assertion of the Hindu Kshatriya identity again may be seen as a way of attaining dignity within the larger social status within Bengal. And then you have the partition, and post-partition there is the rise of a new discourse, Rajbangshi discourse, where it's not just focused on caste or race per se, but you have class, ethnicity, indigeneity, language, culture, all of these parameters of identity become extremely important. There are different kinds of conflict, identity conflicts that the Rajbangshis face around this time. First is between the upper caste identity of the Hindu Bengali immigrants from East Bengal who move into North Bengal, and where the Rajbangshis are seen as the lower castes, despite the Kshatriya movement which has already taken place. So they face caste-based discrimination there. Then secondly, a lot of these immigrants who come from East Bengal, they also get access to land and resources because of the land confiscation that happens under the left regime, due to which Rajbangshis, which were primarily an agrarian community, they lose many of their lands and they become sharecroppers in their own lands. So there is a rise of a class consciousness in this community around this time, due to which even in movements like the Tebaka movement, we have a large participation of Rajbangshi sharecroppers. And then, of course, the entire idea between the settler Bengalis and the native Rajbangshis, that kind of conflict also plays out, where the Rajbangshis, being the indigenous community of North Bengal, they are discriminated and considered inferior based on their culture, their language, their food practices, and so on and so forth. So in the pre-partition era, primarily there is a preponderance of four different kinds of movements that we see within the Rajbangshi community. First is, of course, the rise of a class consciousness. Second is the Kshatriya movement, which still remains prominent in the post-partition, and even till now it's very prominent within the Rajbangshi discourse. Then third, there is a movement for separate statehood with the establishment of political parties like the Uttarakhand Dal and the Kantapur People's Party. And of course then, which is more contemporary, that is the movement of cultural and linguistic autonomy. So what the rise of these different aspects of identity in the post-partition era shows us is a shift in the Rajbangshi identity politics, where we see a shift from a politics of assimilation to a politics of difference. And we also see that their relationship to the metropole or to the dominant groups have not been a linear kind of relationship, but it has been a very complex relationship, sometimes of reverence, sometimes of resistance, and sometimes just of creating alternate subversive discourses on the margins. So in all of this, in this large overview, what remains prominent for me is the idea of resilience, and to just focus on the strategies developed by the community to remain relevant and continue to negotiate for power, voice, and visibility within the larger society. Now, if we look at the colonial context, in the late 19th century, as Anindita Ghosh points out, there was a stratification of Bengali society along the lines of caste, language, culture, religion, and gender, where you have the refined, superior, sanskritized language and culture of the Bengali Bhadralok on one hand, and on the other, the lowly or maley vernacular language and culture, which are also considered to be vulgar and obscene because of their sexually prurient nature. And these are considered to be the culture of the lower orders of the society. And the lower orders of the society are seen to collectively being comprised of women, lower caste, lower class, and Muslims. So alongside this, what happens is around this time, we also see that Rajbangshi is reduced to the status of a dialect of Bengali. And of course, Grierson's Linguistic Survey of India plays an important role also in this kind of construction of the Rajbangshi language as a dialect. And what happens alongside the construction of the Rajbangshi language as a dialect is also the inferiorization of the culture and the folk arts of this community. Because if you look at the folk songs, which are my primary area of study, these folk songs have a very strong female voice. There is eroticism, there is a focus on female desires, there's a focus on the body, and of course the rustic Rajbangshi language. So we see that therefore they become in a way what comprises a culture that is decadent and that is feminine, which basically does not sit well with the nationalist and the dominant idea of the nation, as a result of which there is also a process of sanitization, appropriation, and assimilation of Rajbangshi folk songs that we see happening in the post-colonial period. So if you look at, so when I was thinking about it in relation to caste, because I have primarily looked at the Rajbangshi folk songs, I thought maybe it will be useful to look at the basis on which these songs have been erased or sanitized, and then relate it to larger forms and structures of dominance, to see this process of sanitization and appropriation as one of the mechanisms used by the upper caste and class elites in Bengal to bring the Rajbangshi community within the fold of Hinduism. And one of the important changes that we see around this time is the erosion of the strong female voice in Bhavayagan. And instead, there was a foregrounding of male singers. So this can be read as a maybe as a constraining of the Rajbangshi women according to the according to the dominant norms of Hindu femininity and domesticity, whereby it was understood that within the post-colonial space, women could not be singers and public voices singing Bhavaya for a large audience. Rather, women are constrained, and this was not the case prior to this. Now women are constrained, and instead there is a rise of male singers of Bhavaya. Secondly, alongside the constraining of female singers, we also have a prioritization of spiritual songs over the sexual songs, whereby we can see that they are being assimilated into a higher moral, spiritual, national tradition. And there's a certain way in which the indigenous Rajbangshi culture is being reformed and refined. And Pratima Pandey Borua refers to this when she talks about her experiences in the Indian All India Radio. She talks about how she has been asked to translate the songs not only into Assamese before singing them, but also to focus primarily on only spiritual songs and not sing any of the songs which focus on female desire. Then we also have the rise of performers. And of course, Pratima Pandey Borua is an important name in this field alongside Abbasuddin Ahmed. But what happens is we see that with the rise of performers and with the emergence of the idea of performance, what happens is that most of these performers are outsiders of the Rajbangshi community, and they mostly belong to upper caste and class. So there is a sidelining and marginalization of the original folk, and there is a certain kind of rescuing, a certain kind of politics of voice, which is kind of used by the powerful and the privileged sections of the society, that somehow that the Rajbangshis, being the weak and the poorest sections, needed some kind of rescuing by the upper caste and class. And in the process, what happened is the folk art of the Rajbangshis, they lost their essence, and there was a certain kind of classification which was put into place to kind of suit classification of this folk form to suit the polite taste and sensibility of the upper castes and the middle class in Bengal. Alongside that, there was linguistic appropriation, where the songs are not really broadcast or understood as Rajbangshi songs per se, but they are seen as Bengali songs or Assamese songs, Assamese folk songs. In the process, what happens is it kind of reinstates the understanding that the Rajbangshis are not a distinct community, but they are just a subpart of the dominant and standard Bengali community. And alongside linguistic appropriation, there is geopolitical appropriation, whereby these songs, by calling them Bengali songs or, Rangpuria songs or Golparia songs, there is a fragmentation and dissolution of the autonomous Rajbangshi cultural identity. And rather, these songs actually fostered the creation of a cultural home through the act of singing these songs, because the Rajbangshis, as a community, post-partition, they were also disintegrated and they were divided. They're scattered now across Bengal and Assam in India. They're in parts of Bangladesh and Nepal. But through these songs, they kind of express a diasporic consciousness and they recreate a cultural homeland for themselves. But by refusing to call them Rajbangshi and by calling them Bengali or Rangpuria or say Golparia, that kind of a consciousness was hindered by the dominant sections. And so through these kind of changes which was brought about in the tonality, in the content, and in the perception of these songs, I was thinking that maybe we can then look at the Rajbangshi community and the study of Rajbangshi folk songs as a critical study of caste in two ways. First of all, because it introduces a new community, a less discussed community like the Rajbangshis, and it tries to align it within the discourse of caste. And secondly, because it sheds light on the mechanisms of control and domination used by caste Hindus to bring marginalized groups within their power, and how they use their power to assimilate and oppress various communities on the margins. But despite all this different ways in which the Rajbangshi community was attempted to be brought under the fold of dominant ideas of Hinduism, there is a certain way in which Rajbangshis have resisted. And again, when we talk about Rajbangshi resistance, Rajbangshi folk songs plays a crucial role. For instance, like I mentioned earlier, the act of singing becomes an act of resistance, because first of all, Bhavaya Shomilans were organized across various parts, and these Shomilans became like micro-national spaces where Rajbangshis from all over, from Bangladesh, Nepal, India, they would all gather together and they would sing the songs in their original language, in their unsanitized versions. And so there is a certain kind of critique which comes here of the dominant conception of the nation also. And secondly, there is, as opposed to the shame which is associated with the Rajbangshi identity in the public sphere, Bhavaya Shomilans create a space for the assertion of cultural and linguistic pride of the community. Secondly, we have, in contemporary time, there is a recognition which is being given to indigenous and insider Rajbangshi artists. For instance, you have Mongula Kanto Roy, who received the Padma Shri in March 2023, and Anindita Roy, who is from Moinakuri. She represented Bhavaya, she sang Bhavaya songs at the International Folk Festival in Denmark. So we see that there is a certain kind of reclamation of voice which is happening in the contemporary time, whereby, Rajbangshi insider artists are coming to the foreground, and they are singing the unsanitized versions of the songs, and they are singing not wearing sari, which is the Bengali attire, but they're wearing their indigenous attire. So there is a certain kind of assertion of cultural pride which has taken prominence at present. Also, Rajbangshi language, literature, and Bhavayagan has emerged as a field of study and practice. At present, we have the establishment of Rajbangshi Bhasha Academy, then Bhavaya Shongit Parishad, which organizations particularly act to reinstate the autonomous Rajbangshi identity in Bengal at present. Further, another way in which the Rajbangshi folk songs were constrained was because they were considered oral songs, and they were considered folk songs, which are considered inferior as opposed to the written tradition. So, but at present we see Rajbangshi folk songs transcending this realm of the oral or folk and making a marked entry into the field of Indian literature in English translation per se. Recently, we have Pradhani's, a book has been published by Jyotirmoy Pradhani, which is called This Land, This People, which is a translation of Rajbangshi poetry. And the book, importantly, opens not with a poetry per se, but it opens with an age-old Bhavayagan, which is Dine Dine. And then it goes on to translate many other such lyrics, many other such songs, alongside other Rajbangshi poetry. So there is a certain kind of decentering or subverting that we see happening here, where, binaries like what is mainstream, what is standard, and what is regional, what is local, what is anchalic, that kind of binaries get subverted. So to quickly conclude, I would just like to say that maybe what becomes prominent here, what I have found through my study of Rajbangshi folk songs is, and in order to understand it as also part of Dalit resistance or Dalit consciousness, is to look at the idea of survival. And this survival happens within the case of the Rajbangshi community through a dynamic strategy of transformation and shape-shifting of identities, where we see that they change their identities dynamically. First it's caste, then race, then class, at some point it's gender, at some points it's linguistic and cultural. So different shape-shifting of identities happen, but this happens in the context of survival. And these are used as strategies against domination. So in order to, and when we understand Rajbangshi folk songs within this context, it also brings about a redefinition of the understanding of caste in a certain way, because here then caste is not just a religious or a ritualistic category per se, but we see that caste oppression, which was initially there due to which the Kshatriya movement was started, that kind of spills over into the category of class, into the category of gender, ethnicity, language, culture, and other dimensions of the community. So maybe there is a need to understand caste or caste politics as the politics of otherization and inferiorization. And maybe we can rephrase Dalit, like I said at the beginning of my presentation, that we can maybe reorient our understanding of the Dalit as an emancipatory ideology of the oppressed subject to come out of such power structures and to continue to assert their voice and continue to remain relevant through different courses of history. So I stop here and I welcome feedback and comments, because like I said, this was just an initial thinking that I did in order to orient Rajbangshi discourse and the Dalit discourse. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ishita, please go ahead. Ishita?
Yes. I was having some problem connecting to the interface. Thank you for that presentation, Professor Shumadra Roy. I hope I have got your name correct. I was wondering if you, since you spoke about the Rajbangshi cultural expressions, their own distinct cultural expressions, and the and an attempt to appropriate those. Have you come across Rajbangshi Dhada or riddles? Rajbangshi riddles, yeah. RIDDLES. I'm spelling it out if you're not getting it. Yeah, that's my question. Yeah.
Yes, actually, there are a lot of riddles, but I'm sorry, I've not really looked at riddles as part of my thesis. But I think I'll take a look at it. Thank you, Ishita.
Yeah, because the riddles again is one of those areas which is clearly distinct. It has a distinct Rajbangshi tradition. I think you can look up Dhaneshwar Burman's work since you're working on this. Right. Thank you.
Yes, I will look it up.
I think Shamrat was next, and then Joydeep.
Yeah, I was just wondering, it's more like a clarification than a question, that if we could relate.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, it's audible.
Yeah, I was just wondering that, it's more like a comment or a reflection than a question. I was just wondering if we can connect the idea of, kind of subaltern sexuality as a form of threat to the majoritarian Brahminical Hindu identity, as it is posed often in the context of Dalit women's writing, with the Bhavaya songs you are mentioning, because what is basically the indigenous sexuality of women? What is the process of gendering, and how it is different from the dominant Brahminical ideology, particularly in the context of the Rajbangshi? That would be an interesting discussion to lead on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shamrat. Yes, actually, that is a question that I have been working on. And yes, I actually look at, like I said, the Bhavaya songs are mostly predominantly women's songs. And when we look at the songs, you have not just, of course, there are songs where the women are mostly, these are songs of longing, because they are singing for their husbands who have gone away, right, for work, and they are left behind at home alone. But these songs, the longing is expressed in physical terms, in terms of their desire, erotic desires, as opposed to, spiritual or emotional longing per se. And then not only this, but there are also songs of widows, and child widows, and in those songs, rather than talking about the strict disciplined life that widows are supposed to follow, the widows are actually talking about, how now they are free, right? And they some songs are addressed to their lovers, and they talk about they want to run away from their homes, and they want to go away with their lovers, and they talk about consummation of their desires. And there's a particular song where she says, this is a song by a married woman, and she says that if my husband dies, I will not follow any of the rules of widowhood, but the day my lover dies, that day my heart will be shattered, and I wouldn't know what to do. So there is a prominent challenge posed to Brahminical patriarchal ideas. So thank you. I think we can discuss this later.
Joydeep.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. This is not at all a question. I have a curiosity that is particularly about the method of the paper, because in the beginning of this paper, you are trying to investigate your research area through ontologically, right? And also, your end of this paper, you are talking about the oppressed subject at Rajbangshi. So my curiosity, how do you put into the together? Because if you look into the ontological investigation, actually ontological investigation, as I know, it discards the subjective understanding, which is more close about the phenomenal way. That's my curiosity, actually, if you just clarify it. You got my point. Hello?
Yes, am I audible?
Yeah.
I think most of my research the subject the idea of subjecthood, selfhood, and subjectivity becomes prominent. It is not so much talking about it's more about the idea of the oppressed subject, looking at how the subject was oppressed and the rise of a new kind of resistant subjectivity. That is what I have tried to focus on. It is I would not say I'm doing an ontological study per se, but
Okay. Dhananjay?
Thank you, Sumodra, for your nice presentation. I am curious about to know that how do you see that Rajbangshi as a caste identity or linguistic identity or ethnic? Because when you talked about the Rajbangshi Bhawiya song and in the Rajbangshi identity, they have a parallel identity of the Kantapuri identity. Because in the Rajbangshi Bhasha Academy, the government had now given them the Kantapuri Bhasha Academy. So their identity is not shifted. Their identity is not strict into one identity, because they are shifting their terrain identity from one to another. So how do you see this identity shifting? Because when you talked about the Bhawiya song, in Bhawiya song, the Bhawiya song is not only sung by only Rajbangshi community, because there are many others North Bengal regional community like Nokshoshek, they are participating the Bhawiya song. In Kushiabari Holeshwar Maidan, there is one organized ceremony of government of West Bengal Cultural Affairs. I have visited. I see that there is a Bhawiya song academy which was established, and they are sung many various community are sung in this academy, Bhawiya academy. So how do you see Rajbangshi as a caste, as a Dalit caste, or as a ethnic, or as a linguistic identity? So my question is, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dhananjay. I think, yes, the question of if we try to kind of understand Rajbangshi identity as a static or a quintessential identity, I think we face a lot of challenge, and that is a challenge that I have also been facing, because, and like I have said through my research, what I found is that there's different ways of understanding. For instance, the entire idea of the caste identity, the larger sections, since the Kshatriya movement is still very prominent, so there is Kshatriya Shomiti, in which a lot of Rajbangshis are still, they are part of the Kshatriya Shomiti, and they still assert their Kshatriya identity. So in that case, then if you just look at the Kshatriya identity, then it becomes very difficult to reorient and understand the Rajbangshi as Dalit, as part of the Dalit community per se. But again, like I referred to in my presentation also, what I've done through my reading of Bhavaya Gan is to see how these songs have been used in different junctures to talk about different kinds of identities. And the Rajbangshi community itself is very fragmented. One is, of course, like you have mentioned, like there is the Kamtapuri identity and the Rajbangshi identity, and this is also a strong contention within the community. It's a conflict within the community because the government talks about them as Kamtapuri, but there is a section of the Rajbangshi community who believes that Kamtapuri should not be the right terminology to use. Rather, it should be Rajbangshi. Right? Then there are other sections which believe that Koch Rajbangshi is the term which should be used. So there are a lot of conflicts, and I think that this kind of conflict, and that is why Girindra Narayan Ray also talks about the Rajbangshi identity as a fuzzy identity per se, which is fluid and it keeps changing shapes per se. So what was what I tried to do, and what I try, the way I look at it is to just look at it as the different modes used by the community. So rather than saying that it is only a Dalit subjectivity that we see in, say, or a lower caste identity that we see in the Rajbangshi community, or they are discriminated solely on the basis of caste, to look at it at various, that the Rajbangshis have always occupied a inferior and marginalized position. Sometimes this marginality has been understood as caste marginality, sometimes racial, sometimes class, sometimes related to their language and related to their culture. But what becomes important is to look at it not to maybe try to understand what is the Rajbangshi identity per se, but how the Rajbangshi identity becomes a resistant and defiant category per se in contesting the various kinds of powers which try to oppress them and put them into these various boxes, tight boxes of caste, class, and so on and so forth. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Kullan, should we move on or take more questions?
Do we have time? Are we running out of time? Are we lagging behind?
We're kind of, it's fine because Dayavati is not here.
Exactly, yeah.
But let's try and wrap up this session within 5 minutes.
Right. I had a tiny question for Shumadhura. Shumadhura, that was a very cogent presentation. Shumadhura, I was thinking of, I have 2-3 questions, but I will not ask all of them. I'll just stick to one. I know that there are some Dalit activist scholars who have worked on what we call folk cultures, folk literatures, folk songs, folk narratives, etc., etc. And many of them, especially those who are working on the folk literatures and folk songs, are methodologically uncomfortable with the way Dalit studies engages with the caste question. I understand that you were not initially looking into the Dalit studies framework, so to speak, and in fact, critical caste studies is in some ways a departure from the Dalit studies framework, as we understand it. Right at the beginning, we talked about it. Deepen and I have talked about this. So I'm not pushing you too hard to look into the Dalit studies framework, but I'm just wondering, because some Dalit activists and scholars I can share some of those articles as well. They have talked about this overemphasis on the folk on the other end of the spectrum. So there are people doing folk studies not comfortable with Dalit studies framework, and Dalit studies people not comfortable with folk studies framework, by suggesting that the Dalit studies framework is a more politically loaded, more emancipatory kind of framework to talk about things that have been hijacked by the folk framework, right? That's the way they are polemically putting this. So I was wondering if you have looked into this sort of politics of allegations in the way you are thinking of Rajbangshi Bhavaiya songs, and this is something that is important for us to think through, because let me share a very quick anecdote. I'm organized with the Paschim Dalit Sahitya Academy, and the president Muruganin Bapari was not very comfortable with the way Radhakrishna's prem was being discussed. So it was not a discomfort with prem as such, because Bapari is not, as a Namashudra writer himself, is not suffering from the nationalist caste Hindu elites' anxieties about lower caste sexuality being narrativized through these folk performances. But he was suggesting that, this overemphasis on Radhakrishna and this focus on Krishna in some of the Bhavaya songs, and Anindita was performing, Anindita Roy was performing. And he was uncomfortable with that. His whole suggestion was that it's, in some sense, it takes us away from the Ambedkarite, Dalit literary cultural discourse, because it can be easily appropriated by the so-called Hindutva political groups. I'm not sure whether you have looked into that kind of contemporary political context while doing your research, and if yes, what kind of things have you come across? So these are two conjoined questions.
Thank you so much. I have not extensively looked into these things, but I would appreciate if you could please share some of these critiques, this entire debate between. Yes.
Yeah, I can just quickly mention one. There is one article that is available in the journal, Sage Journal, Contemporary Voice of Dalit, in which Dishadati Borgi makes this argument that, and she is talking about Advaita Mallavarman's Hitashikti Nudin Nam. To the best of my knowledge, I think she is suggesting that the way there has been a focus on folk literature, folk culture, has actually not allowed a lot of Dalit writers, activists, and other non-Dalit people, non-Dalit readers, and audience to focus on the caste question as much as they should have or could have focused on. Because Advaita Mallavarman's novel Pitashikti Nudinam has too many songs in it. So her paper is on that.
Right. I'll definitely take a look at that, and I do not know much what to say, but what you said about Anindita's performance and the songs, how some of them use Krishna, and so I was talking with one of Anindita's father, actually Dinesh Chandra Rai. So I was speaking to him in one of my encounters, and he. I talked about this. I asked him that because so many of the songs of desire also, that they refer to the lover as through various names of Krishna. Like, it'll either be Kala or Stambondhu, right? So I was asking, is there a Vaishnav influence on these Rajbangshi songs? And he said, at present a lot of work which is being done on folk and on Rajbangshi folk songs also, they tend to see that this is some kind of a Vaishnav influence, but maybe, for instance, the use of Changra Bondhu or all these terms which are used in Bhavaya Gan to refer to the lovers, maybe we should not see it as a Vaishnav influence on Bhavaya, as a result of which Bhavaya is giving rise to these kind of terms, but maybe we should see it the other way, where this Changra Bondhu and all these terms which are used to refer to the lover, maybe these are indigenous ways of, distinctly Rajbangshi ways of talking about the lover, and that has been appropriated by the Vaishnava movement, and then, the songs which came out of it. So that is something that came to my mind from what you asked. But yes, I will definitely look into.
Changra Bondhu is such a wonderful name. Anyway, let's move on to the next question or presentation. Doipanda?
হ্যাঁ আমার মনে হয় একটু let's take a break and reconvene in 5 minutes. It's 7:55 here, so let's reconvene at 8. ওখানে কটা বাজে?
এখানে I think it's 5:26.
5:26.
5:26. So let's reconvene at 5:30 then.
Okay.
Just after 5:30. Thank you so much. Shall we continue?
Yeah, let's start
Let's
the next.
Next presentation is Ishita.
Ishita, could you please briefly introduce yourself? We initially thought we would introduce the speakers, but then we didn't get the information from all the participants. So
Yeah.
yeah, please.
Thank you for asking me to be a part of this very good initiative on caste question and Bengal. I'm Ishita Roy. I teach English at the Department of English, University of Göttingen, and I did my MPhil from JNU, and my PhD is ongoing on caste politics and literature. So this paper that I have kind of tried to, write or present for this workshop is a little bit kind of amalgamation of a number of ideas. One of the idea I have already had it, in a detailed form in a publication, which is sanskritization. But later on, I also talk about certain other concepts. For example, the question of the meritorious, the question of the reformer, the question of the comfort, and I try to problematize it with the question of caste. So the basic thrust of whatever I would like to share with the participants and everybody present here in the workshop is about a certain, if I can say it, a psychology of caste or caste psychology. Something that Ambedkar talks about in Annihilation of Caste, where caste can be also understood as a notion. So the basic thrust is that in the understanding of caste, there is a sense of hierarchy. So caste-based society is strongly associated with a sense of hierarchy. I am emphasizing on this sense of hierarchy, in which different castes are ordered into ranks of high and low, depending on their social, ritual, privilege or disadvantage. And therefore, it's an organic feature of the South Asian social system. In no way caste is a matter of past, given its hierarchical sense, which again, following Ambedkar, I argue that it is an inseparable part of the caste-based system, because otherwise, caste in its formation or, in the mechanism in which Ambedkar talks about in the 1916 essay, gets published in 1917, without this hierarchical sense, caste would not make much sense as it. Caste would become non-existent, ineffective, meaningless in that sense. In fact, caste will cease to be. So the hierarchical sense is what which lends this solidity to the idea of caste and to the phenomenon of caste. And having caste, therefore, as a foundational element, as an inseparable part, it is also understood that, therefore, caste-based discrimination is not, again, a matter of past. Neither is caste-based violence, nor caste-based humiliation, nor caste-based discrimination, neither caste-based hegemony, and all sort of hegemony, political, cultural, social, all owing to this difference of caste. So, for example, I'm trying to understand the pervasive quality of caste and what retains this pervasive quality of caste, this pervasiveness of caste, this kind of consent to caste. So, for example, and in a way, how it gets naturalized. It gets naturalized to an extent that it almost becomes, a natural, habitual practice. So, for example, I have given an example in the paper where I came across this WhatsApp message, which, post-COVID situation, and a particular child is being, lost its parents, and there's a message of adoption plea for the child. But in the adoption plea, there is this highlighting of the Brahmin caste of the child. So in this, one wonders that if at all there would be the necessity to mention caste identity of the child, and then further complicated, had it not been born into a Brahmin household, or had the child been born into a Shudra household, would that adoption plea again highlight that, so and so Shudra caste. So the idea of highlighting Brahmin caste was to increase the the kind of the chances of adaptability. Obviously going by the perception that this would be more desirable. So this is a kind of social psychological perception about caste. If we somehow theoretically put it, the two ends of which could be Brahmin perfectibility, ability, superiority, and the other would be the non-Brahmin or the Shudra, the untouchable, imperfectibility. These categories are not synonymous, Shudra, untouchable, but we are going for a kind of necessary generalization, can use that term. So untouchable, imperfectibility, disability, inferiority, that kind of circulates in our everyday cultural and social life. I will give another example. For example, Mr. Rajendra Trivedi, in a speech at this mega Brahman business summit, proclaims that it is the birthright of Brahmins to give blessings to everyone and pray for the welfare of the whole world. And then he, in order to substantiate his point, he further takes the example of Abhijit Banerjee winning the Nobel Prize, where he says, that kind of all the out of 8 Nobel Prize winners, 7 are Brahmins, and the 9th winner, Abhijit Banerjee, is a Brahmin too. And so, in a way, from Mr. Trivedi's speech, what we can infer is that there is certain caste identity that about achievement, about altruism, about knowledge, about help, about care, about merit. Just like and in that sense also a very specific caste. Just as sweeping or scavenging or labor has a very specific caste. In that kind of intelligibility, Ambedkar then becomes this oxymoronic proposition by being an untouchable scholar. So because untouchable and being a scholar simply don't go together, something that Ambedkar also sarcastically invokes in the beginning of Annihilation of Caste, that why have Jat Parak Mandal invited me? They're according to their Shastrik order, it's the Brahman who is the guru or who is the teacher. So the psychology of caste continues to work to this day, and it's an intrinsic, in fact, a foundational element to practicing caste discrimination or entertaining caste prejudice, quite often unconsciously and unproblematically. And not always the case that it is the Brahmin or the caste dominant who kind of, who does this, but it is also something which, again, is seen from, being adopted by those who are ostensibly its victims. So, that makes caste a more complex and a more pernicious problem. That is the natural adoption of such a psychology, even by those who are kind of its victims. Therefore, tracing this caste psychology to initiate a critique of caste becomes an urgent task. And I'll refer to Ambedkar's caste genesis, mechanism and development, and annihilation of caste in selective ways, in order to kind of have this understanding that caste as a matter of social psychology binds everyone to articulate and internalize in oneself this sanctity, this inviolability, and the naturality of caste that that exist in our society. So Ambedkar, for example, says that the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra are names. These are names, but they become problematic, and they are problematic. A source of terror sometimes, because they are associated with a definite and fixed notion in the mind of every Hindu. And that notion is that of a hierarchy based on birth, unquote. So the complexity of the system of caste arises not merely because a Brahmin community leader encourages the theory of caste merit and associate merit with a community. The problem assumes a driven nature when the same thought pattern may be repeated and endorsed, covetously nourished, even by the caste oppressed. So I'm talking about a social situation where caste prevails, and one of the ways in which I'm suggesting is this, where socially Brahminism is upheld as a positive value by both the Brahmin and the non-Brahmin alike, irrespective of our caste identity. Sundar Sarukar has explained this universal cherished value of Brahminhood as an object of aspiration by the all and sundry. And the more unattainable the value, the more is its legitimacy as a value. So you make it more exclusive artificially, and you make it more, kind of value worthy in the common sense of mind, almost like inflation. So, as Sarukai argues, therefore, that the Brahmins herself, who despite being born into Brahmin caste, might also fall short of the required ideal of Brahminhood, and hence not a true Brahmin. And again, quite known to all of us that diametrically an opposite situation prevails with respect to the untouchable caste. So the untouchable caste is derided as non-value, sign of dirt with the body of the untouchable being a repository of dirt. So if we go back to Ambedkar's paper, 1917 paper, where he argues that it was not so much a system, this was in the beginning of his work on caste, not so much a system that was imposed by a specific social class like the Brahmins, but rather it evolved as other social groups imitated the Brahminical practice of endogamy whereby the latter turned inwards, refusing all matrimonial unions except those among their own community. And Ambedkar goes on to argue that the customs of sati and widowhood and girl marriage, these are characteristic. These are intended to maintain endogamy, the characteristic feature of caste type stratification. And in Ambedkar's conclusion, then the existence of the said custom in other class, except the Brahmin, were derivative in nature. For it is, then I'm quoting him, for it is the former classes' imitation of customs, in other words, imitation of the Brahmin, that led to the creation of distinct caste, different caste forming out of different or imperfect imitation. Interestingly, this also anticipates what M.N. Srinivas would later term as sanskritization, and something that Christopher Jaffe also notes in the book Dr. Ambedkar and Untouchability, where Srinivas basically argues that it is a kind of, it denotes social mobility, defines sanskritization as a process by which the low caste Hindu groups changes its custom, ritual, or ideology in the direction of the so-called high caste, and that it is accompanied by a claim to a higher position in the caste hierarchy than the position that is traditionally considered to the claimant caste by the local community. So, in a nutshell, according to Srinivas, then, because there is a popularity of the Varna model that, especially among the urban and educated Indians, that we tend to think that caste is immobile, caste is a fixed institution, and so on and so forth. But if we think of in terms of what is going on at the local level, then we will see that it's not so much an immobile system, but it is kind of a socially mobile situation. So, effective argument that is made by Srinivas on sanskritization is that it functions to bridge the gap between the secular and the ritual rank of caste, and that it has been a process of major cultural change in Indian history. Now, I am arguing not against the social phenomenon of sanskritization, because sanskritization is indeed a social fact. I myself, being a Nomoshudra and coming from a Nomoshudra family where my maternal side, it's a huge family. I can tell you from my own experience that they are least caste conscious, or they are least politically aware, or even aware of basic rights and everything, apart from the kind of benefit that one gets because of reservation. So, but entirely a Sanskritized class, never bothered to question about, inquire into one's own history or anything like that. So, Sanskritization, Srinivas, Sanskritization is a social fact, but what I am arguing is that ultimately there is a political efficacy of Sanskritization. So, I'm trying to look at Sanskritization as a cultural, kind of ideology, cultural weapon that helps establish consensus, common consensus about caste, which then consequently kind of reduces the political awakening of a particular caste, and kind of restricts one to question what are the conditions that have made a particular caste into a subaltern caste, or why is a particular caste identity perceived as a low caste identity in the first place. So I am talking about this political efficacy of Sanskritization that serves to keep the ideological order of caste alive. So, one can understand it as yet another cultural weapon in the arsenal of the caste dominant to keep the faith in the presumed truthfulness of caste identity worth nexus. Because caste identity, without that accompanied perception about worth, is something that we have to constantly think about. I mean, we can't think about a caste identity without that accompanied worth question that is always there. So what I argue is that there is an inherent paradox in sanskritization as a concept of social mobility. While it appears to stand for upward ascendancy, it might appear to look like that, but the very substance of it exposes the falsity of the concept of advancement as understood, and even to a good extent justifies the principle of caste, for which I have just made an analysis, and I'll quickly talk about that. So if you look at Srinivasa's concept, it is basically based on a separation of the Varna model from the caste system. So Srinivasa's separation of the Varna model from that of caste system on ground of empirical socio-economic reality of interactions among various castes is again something that is common to anthropological studies on caste that also insist on a separation of Varna from caste, taking the example of class, modern class, for example. But again, we can problematize this to some extent. So modern class, for example, in the work Caste, the Emergence of South Asian Social System, leaves out Varna from denoting the same meaning as that of caste. According to class, Varnas do not represent any formal structure or organization, neither do they show any unity or leadership or control over its members as contrary to caste. Therefore, Varna is not of any practical use. And even for caste, modern class terms it as human aggregations. So, following, Adrian Mayer, class arrives at this conclusion that caste is not an undifferentiated, indivisible, endogamous body or group, unlike the common man or an outsider's perception to be so. Now, my insistence is on this perception part, that why do we, can we count the perception factor as in, besides the other, empirical findings. For example, I'll repeat this once again. Class arrives at this conclusion that caste is not an undifferentiated, indivisible, endogamous body or group, unlike the common man or an outsider's perception. Now, my emphasis is on this perception. So both Varna and caste, I'm not quoting modern class, just that part where he quotes Adrian Mayer. For people of other caste do not, as a rule, regard caste as some of the constituent subcaste, but all of it as an undifferentiated group. So, class terms this basic socio-political unit in the social system as merit circle in structural terms at the empirical level. While this may be an attempt to clarify the system of caste and how it plays out in everyday form, it is in practical essence a system of different subcastes with their own occupational specification, marital rules, and such. Now, but the analysis also reveals what it argues against, that this is not how generally people think of caste. They do not, so people generally do not regard it in terms of subcaste. People rather see it as an undifferentiated whole. And this tells us a lot about what human perception has to do with maintaining and distributing caste in terms of the hierarchical arrangement, where some occupy a ritually, socially, politically low position, while some occupy high positions. So, while classes analysis about the smallest endogamous unit of merit circle in explaining the origin of caste system in India may be anthropologically correct, it fails to or does not choose to engage with the implication of a common man's perception of caste as undifferentiated group that goes in a long way in lending to caste system in India an overall notion of naturalness that is difficult to dispel. So if we were to address the notions of inequality that caste by principle and practice give rise to among people, we cannot perhaps overlook or choose to theoretically disengage with the implication of the fact that how common man perceive it. So it is to this notion of the common man's perception of caste, besides the structural elements, whether observable at the empirical level as subcaste or merit circle, like subcaste is something that G.S. Gure talks about, that it is argued that the final inefficacy of a Varna caste separation, in an Ambedkarite Gramscian critique of caste. So what I argue basically is that sanskritization, among other strategies, can be called as the soft appropriation strategy by caste dominant class to maintain a power structure whereby sanctioning authority of the social because it all boils down to social acceptability and all of that, shall remain within this classes. So if we go back to Srinivasa's thesis, we will see that one of the assumptions that Srinivas makes with regard to the formulation of sanskritization and its relation to mobility depends on the separation between Varna model and the empirical plurality of caste. Now, this is something which is problematic, which I'm trying to argue. Again, on the taking a clue from Ambedkar. So it seems that in Srinivasian mobility, caste is understood as merely materialistic, and that the expression of caste has to do with its material expression. That caste is what an occupation is. And therefore, with positional change, like if you can read it as occupation, there follows a mobility. It's problematic because caste is again inseparably linked with the concept of Varna model that enables caste to become symbolic. So had caste only been a material phenomena, movement in terms of advancement, a more equal standing would have been possible. On the contrary, in a Sanskritized movement, one caste moves from one position to another, but the previous place does not wither in terms of its notional existence. As a consequence of advancement, the previous position does not suffer any natural death. Rather, the conceptual or the notional facticity of caste remains. This notional facticity of caste is again at the core of the Varna model. Srinivasa's separation of Varna from caste does not logically stand, as it is Varna that has rendered the materiality of caste into a symbolic phenomena in the first place. Hence, there is a continuous unfolding of different castes or desires. In fact, caste is born to give expression to the symbolic. Every time a new caste is born, it validates the idea of the Varna model. It kind of sustains the Varna theory. And so on this complex question of caste relation to Varna, I fall back on Ambedkar, who argues in Annihilation of Caste in a way that I read that caste and Varna are inseparable, and it is precisely the logical untenability of a Varna model in a practical world that we see the birth of caste. Although the two theories posit a difference, Varna being a theory of worth and caste being a theory of birth, Ambedkar asserts that in the practical domain it is logically impossible to sustain this difference other than having the system of caste operative. So, and then he goes on to talk about that apart from this, there is also a philosophically, this Varna order is also philosophically problematic as well as logically untenable. I'll end the paper with this, with an account of the philosophically problematic, by referring to Ambedkar's analysis of the Ram Shambhuk episode in Annihilation of Caste, and I'll offer an analysis of that myself. So one of the difficulties that Ambedkar argues with regard to the Chaturvarna is the problem of maintenance. He's like, even if we assume for a moment that Chaturvarna is ideal, how do we maintain the system of Chaturvarna without, a kind of punitive measure? So how does one maintain the system of Chaturvarna, assuming that it is an ideal one? To maintain it, it must be that a member of one Varna does not transgress to be a member of another Varna. In other words, that if that is not the case, then whether there is something as Chaturvarna or whether there is not, it becomes a meaningless question, for it would not make any difference. So the ideal of Chaturvarna stands as long as there is a guarantee that no Varna will mix up with another. For this, it follows that there must be a penal system to check a potential transgressor. And so Ambedkar writes that the system of Chaturvarna must perpetually face the problem of the transgressor. It cannot subsist by its own inherent goodness. It must be enforced by law. So in other words, it is reasonable that, recognizing Chaturvarna penal section is inevitable. And he draws on the story of Ram and Shambhuka to point out the reason why Chaturvarna is incapable of sustaining itself by its own virtue unless there is a punitive measure behind it which can be enforced against everyone transgressing Varna. And again, since one cannot force individual to confine themselves to a single Varna, for the underlying principle of Varna as opposed to caste is worth instead of birth, it is but logical that individuals will try and develop to improve their worth according to the desired Varna status. And because the ideal Varna Vyavastha orders the classification of people into 4 Varnas, whereby there is implied a hierarchical division of high and low based on birth, on virtue of which the Brahmin is associated with the notion of superiority and the Shudra with inferiority in a descending scale of reference. It is logical that people will try to move up the ladder. In other words, transgress. So Shambhuk, who wanted to elevate his status from the status of Shura through mediation and austerities, did transgress, if the premise of Chaturvarna is to be considered. Now, Ram on finding this, beheads Shambuk. By implication, being a king, it was absolutely lawful on his part to behead Shambuk, for that was what the idol of Chaturvarna demanded. For this act of transgression, not just a mere penalty was enough, but to observe the rule of Chaturvarna, it was absolutely necessary that Ram inflict on Shambuk the penalty of death, which is annihilation. So I'm arguing that, through this analysis, Ambedkar introduces the problem of ethics. What is more ethical, to kill someone for a particular action that does not conform to the standard of judgment laid down by Chaturvarna, or to not kill Shambuk and instead allow for an open transgression of the law of the land, which is Chaturvarna? So the central question would be, similar to this core philosophical question of life, to be or not to be. So with Chaturvarna as an established system of social order, transgression is inevitable and even natural. The deeply ethical problem involved here is the question of preference. What should be the preferred thing to do? To allow transgression? For transgression implies one's natural desire to grow in character and person in one's own desired way, or to allow the proper maintenance of Chaturvarna that is based on a prior division of people into Varnas. For both the course of action are justifiable in their own right. So it can't be that individuals are dictated to act in a certain way. For that would amount to undermining individual spontaneity and therefore be a fundamental assault on the freedom to choose, which any society that aspires to restore some amount of autonomy to the individual cannot desire in the least. So we see transgression is preferable if individual freedom is a cherished value, and Chaturvarna if an individual submission to dharma is the moral goal. And dharma is the basis of personal and social life in the society of Hindus. Any violation of it would constitute a moral threat to its existence. Therefore, it is of paramount necessity that every Hindu abide by their dharma. So in Hindu political thought, political authority rested on the twin foundation of duty and punishment, whereby by popular recognition, the king devoted to the maintenance of dharma would not hesitate to use the punishment, that is the danda. So it was believed that for a society to remain well, it must to remain well ordered, it must ensure that its individual observe their caste and personal dharma. So if we return to the problem, on the one hand, Ram is bound by his dharma as his duty as a king to observe Chaturvarna. On the other hand, Ram's decision involves a profound ethical deliberation that seems inescapable. So Ram is bound by his duty because, as Ambedkar rightly observes, Chaturvarna is given a divine sanction. So and to go against Chaturvarna would mean going against the Shastras. So we can read the conflict of action in the Ram Shambuk story in terms of the hierarchized oppositional couple, Ram Shambuk, where Ram's duty is superior to Shambuk's aspiration to do something other than the idol. The problem of ethical deliberation that Ram's decision to kill Shambuk involves, although inescapable, is nevertheless not absolutely irresolvable. It is resolvable to the extent that Shambuk's right to choose his way of life is denied. The problem is resolved to Shambuk's detriment. It is in this regard, seen from the perspective of Shambuk, that the so-called idol of Chaturvarna is subjected to moral scrutiny, and therefore it is not above the moral test. It is now rather seen, so it's a kind of critique that is being performed here. It is now seen as either desirable or despicable, for it works to restore the privilege and prestige of the Brahmin at the cost of denying it to Shudra. Therefore, it's drawing on these arguments, it's kind of pertinent that caste is also conceptualized in terms of this ideological, the notional, all interacting within the single system of caste. And when we apply this to sanskritization, we see that that is one of the reasons that with positional change, a former caste does not wither away in the onslaught of the new. Rather, the former becomes a newly vacant space for someone lower to occupy, and this system of place change continues to this never-ending infinite regress. So the various attempt, so I've just tried to use this concept and to kind of critique this desire for upgrading one's status, one's social status, because social status is pertinent on social acceptability, which is again further dependent on, contingent on social acceptability, which is again contingent on the way the Varna system, or the Varna order of the caste are maintained in the society. So I'm not very sure whether the project is going to be, I mean, whether to what extent this can be applied. But if one thinks of the various attempt at various times by various caste group to change their caste name, kind of again reveals a certain hierarchical essence of a system like that of caste. Even in case of Bengal, if you look at the history of it, we'll see. If sanskritization, as Srinivas argues, is a proof of the flexibility of a system like caste, it is, I argue, that a proof of inherent unequal philosophical basis of the caste system. Therefore, it does not solve the problem of caste. So in one word, sanskritization, in that sense, from the perspective of the Dalit, would be something which is strongly ideological and politically informed, because in the desired movement from a material position of one caste to another by incorporating practice, change of occupation, migration, need for socialization, there is this obvious rebounded implication of the sanctity, unchangeability, the solidity, permanence, essentiality of the notional idea or aspect of caste, whose terrestrial version may be taken as the male Brahmin. So if a census record from 1872 to 1931 show that various castes try to upgrade their status within the caste framework, the Rajbangshi movement of the North Bengal, 1910, 1947, same kind of movement, where, again, if you think of the Kshatriya Sabha, the Rajbangshi's formation of the Kshatriya Sabha in 1910 was the objective to enhance the interest of the Rajbangshi by seeking greater representation in public life and in the bureaucracy. We can take the example of even the Nomashudros. So of the three largest castes, the Nomashudros, the Mahishos, and the Rajbangshis, we can take the example of Mahishos also, split from the Ghashi Koibortos to form and get recognition as a separate caste community. So, for example, in around 1872, in the village of Andul Mouri near Kolkata, a few Koibortos refused to accept food from Jogi community. This is again another example where the Jogi community, originally community of Tatis, they got upset by the fact that they were refused by the Koibortos. And they went to the Brahmin Pandit of Sanskrit College to ask if they should be considered a pure caste or an impure one. And then, they were generally accepted as a community of good behavior, following which some of them also began the practice of donning the sacred thread. I spoke of the Namashudra example, and I think I've crossed time, I don't know. In 1908, for example, Rai Charan Bishwas in Nomashudra Shurid writes that even though the Brahmins hate the Nomashudras, the latter for ages had been practicing Brahminical ritual and practices, and observing the same, anyone could tell that the Nomashudras are descendants of ancient pure Brahmin sage, and that their occupation being agriculture, one of the most pure and prestigious, that they should be regarded as the highest caste. So this desire for social respectability on the basis of affiliation and proximity to whatever is associated with Brahmanism, kind of appears to be, an unfailing situation, given the hierarchical superiority that the social class already enjoys. So the Namashudra example is a proof of the fact that that claiming oneself for a separate identity was not yet the method of acquiring lost respect. Rather, it lay in the claim to associate oneself with the superior to rise in social rank. So if I'm doing, and I have in the paper, I have kind of given the point as points of departure from which I could probably elaborate and talk. So I elaborated here on the Ram Shambhuk episode, which is not there in the paper, but I had just introduced, but I did not detail it because I wanted to elaborate it out in the presentation form. I have then taken some examples from Manohar Mauli Bishwas's poems, which again talk about the way in which caste identity gets kind of, if one's caste identity is disclosed as, say, for example, scheduled caste, the kind of taunt, the kind of humiliation that a person goes through. So I have given some example of Bishwa's poem. So one poem, for example, it is seen that the poet tries to communicate the incommunicable hurt and taunt that a scheduled caste in a public place is often handed down by other castes and communities in a society that all castes ostensibly claim to share together. So he writes that on certain days, I have translated it, on certain days some such things happen I can find no reason for. And then I feel maybe this happened to me because I am a quote-unquote golden moon. So the golden moon in Bangla reads as Sonar Chand, the first initial of which make the phrase correspond to the short form of the governmental term scheduled caste, SC, for caste subaltern communities, and the phrase is commonly used to derogatorily refer to the scheduled caste to avail for themselves the reservation. Same applies with respect to scheduled tribe communities also, where they are called as Sonar Tukro, as ST. And these are some of the experiences that that continue to this day, which give us a glimpse of the perceptual understanding of the perceptual bias with respect to a particular caste identity, whether desirability for a particular caste type, for a spouse of a particular caste identity, desirability of getting married into a particular caste community, and also the desire to proclaim one's caste as by adopting practices that are more mainstream, that are probably more acceptable. This is something that I have tried to give a glimpse of or share with all of you here, although this is not any this work is not a part of any doctoral thesis or anything, but this is what I have been thinking in terms of some of the methods that I am looking for in order to comment on the ubiquitousness of caste, in order to comment this all-pervasiveness of a caste environment that we live in. Later on in the paper, I give some other examples of, like I said, of the problem of the meritorious, of the problem of the convert, of the problem of the reformer with respect, or of the problem of the dissenter with respect to a caste-based society, and then again the problem between individual and society. And I've also given an example of how a certain statement of a caste privileged person. So we have given the example of filmmaker Adur Gopalakrishnan, chairman of the K.R. Narayan National Institute of Visual Science and Art, where he, in defense of the institute director Shankar Mohan, who was alleged of caste-based discrimination, had said that I am someone who discarded my caste surname at the age of 20. So please don't give me lessons on casteism. Now, the problem with this kind of statement is this, that Gopalakrishnan refuses to understand is that individual revolutionary act as such does not bring a change to the society unless there is a social revolution wherein social mentalities endorsing hierarchies is challenged. This is nevertheless not to undermine the individual revolutionary act, but when we compare it with that of caste system, we also can't help but observe that it is also a matter of caste privilege, caste identity privilege, where you can afford to say that I do not care about caste identity. A similar privilege is not shared by the caste, by somebody born into a caste subaltern community. If even one says that I don't accept caste is something that comes to affect one's life. So I'll keep till here. I hope I was within time.
Thank you, Ishita. There are a series of questions. We're actually running behind time, so let's wrap up this session in about 5 to 10 minutes. But Shamrat and Ratul, please go ahead.
I cannot hear.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a problem. Am I audible?
Yeah, can you hear? Yeah, you are audible.
I can hear, but the sound is suddenly coming very slow. Anyway, yes.
Maybe that. Yeah, can you hear?
Yeah, I can. I've just got it near.
I'm trying to be loud. Yeah. This is a very important area, I think, Ishita. Like the main crux of your paper, which talks about the notion of Varna and caste, the relationship between Varna and caste, and more particularly the question of sanskritization there have been parallel discussions apart from Srinivas's sanskritization argument. We also have the social mobilization argument, which talks about including Dalit experience, including Dalit culture into the upper caste epistemology, upper caste thinking by mobilization, by getting assimilated. So assimilation is not always negative. So it's a very difficult question to deal with. And we also have the notion of religious process, which is a both-way process, which has inclusion and exclusion both. And this is a question which not only pertains to religion, but it also pertains to politics, like the political involvement of Namashudros with TMC or with the BJP Hindutva. It is both a kind of appropriation and also a kind of Dalit assertion. Dalit political assertion, religious assertion often happens through this means. It is one way of, there are two trajectories of Dalit politics. One is to get assimilated. There is this sanskritization process. There is also this process of, to radically break, which you have mentioned also, to radically break from that dominant, cultural construction, the dominant Brahminical form. So these both movements are there. I'm not sure, whether we can do a critique of sanskritization in a blanket way, or this formation of Dalit Sahitya Academy, of which Kolyan is also a part. It is a kind of, someone can say, this is true also, it's a kind of appropriation of the Dalit politics, Dalit literary establishment by the government. But on the other hand, it also helps to include the Dalit experience to the mainstream. So it's a very difficult question. It's almost like the question of gay marriage, I would say, that whether to subscribe to the institution of marriage and talk about empowerment, or to break from it. So it's a very difficult question. I was just try to make this comment. Thank you.
Okay. Am I audible? Because
yes, you are audible. You are audible.
Yes.
Yeah.
See, if you personally ask me, then I will tell you one thing. One, the Trinamool Congress, or whichever political parties, kind of making it an inclusive project. Only one thing that we have to keep in mind. If you think of the history of it, Dalit Sahitya Academy. Now, this is my personal view. Okay. First is who includes who has the power to include, and the next important question is, when does one gets included? When does a political party with a clearly a caste dominant, which is based on caste dominant leadership, not talking about those reserved constituencies where they give ticket to the scheduled castes, political reservation. Apart from that, you have, it is basically a caste dominant leadership. Even in the Marxist rule also, CPIM rule also, it was a caste dominant leadership. Doesn't mean that there was no scheduled caste leadership or there was no chance of developing scheduled caste leadership. There was. My own, uncle, if you probably will know, Binoy Vishwas. He was a CPIM MLA. They are Namashudra people. Again, my another uncle from maternal side, he was also a very popular and well-known person in the CPIM, and during that time, everybody knew in Bonga, Noni Vishwas. So these things are there. But overall, there is no denying that there is a caste hegemony, caste dominant political hegemony we are living under. We don't have any. We haven't had. Bengal is one of the places in which you haven't had any non-Brahmin chief minister except for a caste, except for a Basu. You don't have this any other political leader of that stature coming in, in the form of leadership outside the Brahmin caste nexus. You see, so there is no question. I think there is no doubt about the political hegemony of the caste dominant in Bengal. Second thing is when they are including. They are including and they are giving a platform. First, though, they are giving. So the question is, who is giving the platform? Who has the right to give the platform? This is there. And it is again the caste dominant who has the right to give a platform. And when are they giving the platform? They are giving the platform at a time when it will be when it is at a politically opportune time. This happened with that of the TMC, catering to the Matua Sangh as well. If you look at the history of the timing, then you will see that the Matua Sangh was also approached at a time when there was already at the pan-India level a gradual increase or a gradual increase of the caste consciousness movement, when it was understood that this forms a huge vote. It was then. But again, that is politically I am talking about, political. But what here I am trying to talk about is that, so basically, the idea, all of this comes from the fact that we can't always, or it's necessary now to interpret history, not entirely in terms of the politics, but also in terms of ethical and religious kind of movement. And when we look at ethical religious movement, the cultural sides become important. So I'm trying to argue Sanskritization as that which kind of aids the mind into believing that if you practice if you do Lokhi Pujo every time of the year, then you are more you have raised your social status to the level of where you will not be deemed as impure. This very idea of one's caste identity being associated with impurity or purity is not questioned by those who are Sanskritized. So I'm basically not putting the onus on caste dominant here. I'm putting the onus on caste subaltern communities where where there is a propensity to be Sanskritized. I'm telling you from my own experience that there's a propensity to be Sanskritized. So I was talking about that cultural thing, and I'm like I said that I'm trying to because again in cultural thing, if you think of literature and all, if you look at literary cultures in India by Sheldon Pollock, they have been talking about a certain Sanskritization, which is in terms of language. That I'm not talking here. Although Sanskritization recently, people are talking about Sanskritization as an internal colonialism kind of thing, and imperialism by the caste dominant. That narrative is also there. So Sanskritization as imperial thing, internal imperialism of the caste dominant. I'm not going into that, but at some point that too will come together. But here I'm talking more about the building of the consensus towards an affirmation in caste. Because had it not been, then people should be denying or defying caste, which is absolutely there. But what I'm saying is that therefore, by the implication of whatever I said, the political Dalit becomes of the Sanskritized Dalit, for example. So I'm talking about the Sanskritized Dalit here. So I don't know if I've made sense, but I tried.
Ishita, there are several other questions, and we're getting to the halfway point. So if we can take 2 more questions and then wrap things up in about 10 minutes, and then we'll take a break for about half an hour.
But I think, Dipanda, I think we need to shorten both the questions and the responses to those questions. Unfortunately, we are really running out of time.
Yeah. So
I am also having a problem in actually listening, getting the sound. It suddenly
okay.
So Ms. Ghosh and then Mr. Bishash.
I assume Ms. Ghosh was me. So my name is Eka Boli. My primary, I have 2 questions. The first one is to Dr. Roy directly, which is you make the case of the Sanskritized Dalit versus the political Dalit, but isn't the Sanskritized Dalit also a kind of political Dalit and also a kind of politics? My second question is to both Ishita Roy and Shomrat Sengupta at the same time, which is how do you read Sanskritization vis-a-vis the state? Because anybody who associates, any Dalit person or any marginalized subject who associates with the state is not necessarily automatically getting co-opted into that political power. or getting co-opted into sanskritization in the case of caste. So how do you read that?
Okay. First question I did not get. You are saying that Sanskritized Dalit is also a political Dalit? That is what you're saying?
Yes.
Yes, of course. In that sense, if the thesis that I am giving in terms of political Dalit is somebody who resists Sanskritization. One extreme example could be Ambedkar. He did Sanskritize. I mean, he resisted Sanskritization.
Yes.
He kind of, right? So he is an extreme example of that, of the political Dalit prototype that I am talking about.
Right.
So,
in that case, I would suggest that political Dalit is a misnomer, because Sanskritization has its own politics, and often Dalit subjects come from specific lived experiences, often very liberal, often very exclusive towards other identities as well. But that has its own politics, and often that's a right-wing politics.
Yeah, actually, the political Dalit that I just mentioned here, since this is part of one paper that I did, where I have kind of clearly mentioned that in what sense I am using the term political Dalit and how it is therefore coming as a contraposition to Sanskritized Dalit. And so the second question that you said with respect to its relation to state, yeah, that is something that one is talking about, that it is also there as a desire to be a more legitimate citizen of the state, when the state endorses or is based or is founded on the overall if you're living in a caste gestalt. So you think of what our Prime Minister, Honorable Prime Minister, did with respect to inauguration of the Parliament. So and in that sense, what the presenter before me had said about the Rajbangshi is also that it is a strategy. It is a strategy in that sense also. So it is also a kind of survival strategy, because if the environment is caste environment, then you adopt strategies in order to hide the source of humiliation which you think your caste identity is. Gopal Guru has this work on this.
1 minute, since you mentioned me, just I want to make one point, just a few seconds, that I personally feel that the state politics of including or accepting Dalit identity or privileging it in some way is definitely a form of co-option. But at the same time, there is the possibility of including the Dalitness into politics. So it's a both-way traffic. I think it is also necessary for the Dalits to time and again participate in the state politics. And I agree with you that when you say that, Dalit identity, this participation in the state politics, it doesn't mean complete co-option. It's not a complete co-option. It's also a form of including one's identity. So resistance is not always breaking free completely, but it is also by getting included, one can offer their resistance. That is what I think. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Mr. Bishesh?
Thank you. I have two things to say. Firstly, it is a kind of summarizing the point that you were trying to make. I'm curious that whether it is you are trying to say that Sanskritization can be also looked at as a reflection of a proto-fascist tendency, where it can have a reflexive role at the instance of a rise of a critique, a potential critique of the hegemonic social order. Whenever thus this kind of a critique is arriving, the process of Sanskritization can actually dissuade the Dalits from that critique to the hegemonic order. Towards the hegemonic order. Are you trying to say that? That is the first thing. And the second thing is that I talked about the mixing of the Chaturvarna. So I have a point to make about that the mixing of the Chaturvarna can always be looked at as an emancipatory tool, because you also talked about the psychology of caste at the beginning of the presentation. So can the mixing of the Chaturvarna in the sense that taking up the occupation of the respectable castes or in the caste society, does that have a kind of a dent on the operative psychology behind the caste system? For example, if we look at historically, there have been many Dalit sects where
just কয়েক মিনিট বেরোতে হবে over the break. I've run out of cigarettes. তো আমাকে cigarette তুলতে হবে. So can you wrap things up in 5 minutes? তারপর আধ ঘন্টা পর we'll reconvene. খুব ভালো চলছে.
আমি না কিছু শুনতে পাচ্ছি না। এক কোয়েশ্চেনটা কেউ একটু যদি বলে দেয়।
আমি তো এরকম কোনোদিন।
হ্যালো, কি হলো? I'm not getting. একটু যদি আমি মানে should I leave or is the session over? Like, or because I did not get the question, কেটে কেটে এসছে আর কি। যদি একটু চ্যাট বক্সে লিখে দেওয়া হয় আমি তাহলে বলে দিতে পারবো, মানে আমি চেষ্টা করবো আর কি। আমি ভাষা একটু শুনেছি।
Can I make one point here? This is very interesting and very intellectually provocative paper.
অনির্বাণদা একটু জোরে বলতে হবে, কারণ আমার হঠাৎ করে এটা হলো। এতক্ষণ it was all good, but I don't know what happened to this. Suddenly it happened like this. আমি শুনতেই পারছি না আর কি। I'm not getting.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, it's a very interesting and intellectually provocative paper, and I was just thinking and agreeing to you that's creating a kind of break in the epistemology when you are talking of the purity and all Varna and caste kind of dialectic. It's a quite an impossible and difficult thing, but it is an impossible, but of course it's a kind of necessity at the same time. And while I was reading Franz Fanon, and while you was talking about the Antillean society and the black man and the situation of the black man, and how any kind of unsettlement, any kind of resistance on the part of the black man is thought of, is conceived of as a kind of allowing or a top-down kind of assistance. And therefore I am just agreeing to and confirming to you that this kind of, that you have referred to Ramchandra and Shambhuka's episode, and there are lots of episodes there in the Mahabharata, and there is a kind of epistemic foreclosure on the part of any kind of unsettlement. If we think of the unsettlement on the in terms of caste hierarchy or all these things, that is what I'm trying to make here. That is very interesting that I found in your paper. So thank you, Ishita.
Yeah, okay. I've got 2 comments. Actually, this whole thing, I can give another example, which is very like pertinent, which will probably help. One is the question of race. I have read it, for example, Arundhati Roy in Introduction to the Annotated Edition says that caste is not something which is color coded. So you can't really see caste, and therefore where that discrimination is coming from. So it is coming from a mental perception or a psychological perception. This is one thing that I have spoken of. It's something, and then again, but you can bring in the question of race, or you can bring of question of color binary, the white and the white black issue of the racial question in that sense also, where again there is this concern about the blackness or the black person being socially acceptable as in order to can be socially acceptable when the black person submits to the kind of already embedded in a white society, which is again predicated against the value of blackness as prioritizing the value of whiteness. There is another comment by Orpon Banerjee. I don't know what the person is saying, but definitely not agreeing with whatever I have said. Yes, but I mean, it's not that I am denying the question of sanskritization in modern society. That is not the point here. The question is about how sanskritization is related to the concept of caste ideology, and that how sanskritization is kind of fosters caste ideology in its implied sense. That is what was meant. It wasn't meant that I am denying the role of sanskritization in modern society. That is where we began, that Ambedkar had said that it is, if you think of Ambedkar's argument, then he does give in some way that sanskritization is probably one of the reason that caused caste to origin in the first place as a social phenomena. So you have probably got me wrong. Yeah. So I hope I have answered everybody, except for Mr. Ratul's question, which kind of got lost in the traffic.
Ishita, we can certainly take these questions in the final Q&A in the open discussion forum. Okay, thank you everybody for being so patient with all of us. We'll go for a quick break now. Not very quick break. It's going to be roughly half an hour of break. And then we assemble again at roughly about 7 p.m. IST. So we are looking forward to the next part of our workshop. And let's go for a break. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.